Picture this. You're sitting by a river in a foreign land, far from home, when suddenly the sky tears open and heaven itself comes down to meet you. This is exactly what happened to a young priest named Ezekiel over 2,500 years ago. What he saw that day would change not only his life, but the entire understanding of God's power and presence. Get ready to step into a world where the impossible becomes reality, where divine visions unfold like scenes from the most incredible movie you've ever watched. This isn't just ancient history. This is the beginning of one of the most mind-blowing spiritual journeys ever recorded. Ezekiel was 30 years old, living among the Jewish exiles by the Kebar River in Babylon, when his ordinary day became anything but ordinary. As recorded in Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 1, "In my 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day, while I was among the exiles by the Kebar River, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. The sky above him suddenly split apart, like a curtain being pulled back. What came next would have made anyone fall to their knees in absolute wonder. A massive storm cloud appeared, but this wasn't any normal storm. Lightning flashed continuously inside it, and the entire cloud glowed with an intense fire that seemed alive. From the center of this supernatural storm, something incredible emerged. 4 living creatures stepped out of the fire, and they were unlike anything Ezekiel had ever seen or imagined. As described in verses 5 and 6, in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was human, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. These weren't just unusual beings. They were magnificent, powerful, and clearly not of this world. Each creature had the face of a human in front, but that was just the beginning. On the right side, each had the face of a lion, the king of all beasts, representing royal strength and majesty. On the left side was the face of an ox, symbolizing faithful service and sacrifice. And on the back was the face of an eagle, the master of the skies, representing divine swiftness and heavenly perspective. Their bodies sparkled like polished bronze, and their wings stretched out in perfect formation. When they moved, they didn't turn their bodies like humans do. Instead, they could go in any direction instantly, forward, backward, left or right, without ever changing position. Ezekiel noted in verse 12, each one went straight ahead. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go without turning as they went. But what made them truly extraordinary was what appeared beneath them. Each creature stood beside a wheel that touched the ground, but these wheels defied every law of physics Ezekiel knew. The wheels gleamed like precious stones, and each wheel had another wheel inside it, positioned at right angles. This meant they could roll in any direction without turning, just like the creatures above them. The rims of these wheels were covered with eyes. Not just a few eyes, but completely covered, as if the wheels themselves were alive and could see everything around them. When the creatures moved, the wheels moved with them. When the creatures rose from the ground, the wheels rose too. There was a perfect unity between them, as if they shared the same spirit and purpose. The sound they made was indescribable. Ezekiel wrote in verse 24, "When the creatures moved, I heard the sound of their wings, like the roar of rushing waters, like the voice of the Almighty, like the tumult of an army." It was the sound of pure power, of heaven itself in motion. Above these incredible beings was something that looked like a vast expanse, crystal clear and stretching out like a solid dome. The creature's wings touched this expanse, and beneath it, their wings were spread out toward each other. Each creature had 2 wings covering its body, and 2 wings spread out, creating a canopy of divine protection and reverence. What Ezekiel saw next took his breath away completely. Above the crystal expanse was something that looked like a throne, and this wasn't just any throne. It appeared to be made of sapphire, the most precious and beautiful blue stone known to mankind. But the real wonder wasn't the throne itself, it was who sat upon it. Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 26 records, Above the vault over their heads was what looked like a throne of lapis lazuli, and high above on the throne was a figure like that of a man. This figure radiated an indescribable brightness and glory. From what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal filled with fire. From the waist down, he appeared like fire itself, and brilliant light surrounded him completely. The light wasn't harsh or blinding in a painful way. Instead, it was like seeing the most beautiful rainbow after a storm, but infinitely more magnificent. Ezekiel described it in verse 28. Like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the radiance around him. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. This wasn't just bright light. This was the very presence of God himself, the creator of the universe, choosing to reveal himself to a young priest in exile. The glory that filled Solomon's temple, the presence that led Israel through the wilderness as a pillar of fire, was now appearing directly to Ezekiel in a vision that would change everything. While Ezekiel lay face down, trembling before this incredible vision, he heard a voice speaking to him. It was the voice of the one on the throne, and it carried authority unlike anything he had ever heard. But first, something amazing happened. The Spirit entered into him and set him on his feet, giving him the strength to stand before God's presence. The voice spoke with both tenderness and authority, calling him Son of Man, a title that emphasized his humanity in contrast to the divine glory before him. As recorded in Ezekiel chapter 2, verse 3, God said, "Son of man, I am sending you to the Israelites, to a rebellious nation that has rebelled against me. They and their ancestors have been in revolt against me to this very day." This wasn't going to be an easy assignment. God was completely honest about what Ezekiel would face. The people he was being sent to were described as obstinate and stubborn. They had hard hearts and faces set like flint against God's message. They were like thorns and briars, and Ezekiel would feel like he was living among scorpions. But God's commission continued with both warning and encouragement. In verses 6 and 7, the Lord said, "And you, Son of Man, do not be afraid of them or their words. Do not be afraid, though briars and thorns are all around you and you live among scorpions. Do not be afraid of what they say or be terrified by them, though they are a rebellious people. You must speak my words to them, whether they listen or fail to listen, for they are rebellious." This was perhaps the most challenging job description ever given. Ezekiel was being sent to people who had a track record of rejecting God's messengers, of hardening their hearts against truth, and of choosing their own way over God's way. They might listen, or they might not, but that wasn't Ezekiel's responsibility. His job was simply to deliver God's message faithfully, regardless of their response. The commission came with a clear understanding that success wouldn't be measured by how many people listened or changed their ways. Success would be measured by faithfulness to the message itself. God wasn't asking Ezekiel to be successful in human terms. He was asking him to be obedient. What happened next was unlike anything in recorded history. God presented Ezekiel with a scroll. But this wasn't an ordinary document. As described in Ezekiel chapter 2, verse 9, "Then I looked, and I saw a hand stretched out to me. In it was a scroll, which he unrolled before me." This scroll was covered with writing on both sides, which was unusual for ancient documents. Normally, writing appeared only on one side to preserve the precious material. But this scroll was completely filled with God's message. The content wasn't pleasant. It was words of lament and mourning and woe. Then came the most extraordinary command Ezekiel had ever received. In chapter 3, verse 1, God said, "Son of man, eat what is before you, eat this scroll, then go and speak to the people of Israel." This wasn't symbolic language. God was literally telling Ezekiel to eat the scroll containing his prophetic message. Without hesitation, Ezekiel obeyed this incredible command. He opened his mouth and ate the scroll that God gave him. What happened next was completely unexpected. Despite the scroll being filled with messages of judgment and sorrow, when Ezekiel ate it, it tasted as sweet as honey in his mouth. This amazing transformation revealed something profound about God's word. Even when the message contains difficult truths or warnings of judgment, there's something inherently sweet about receiving revelation from God. The bitterness of the message's content was overshadowed by the sweetness of divine communication itself. God explained the significance of this act in verse 4. He then said to me, "Son of man, go now to the people of Israel and speak my words to them." The scroll hadn't just been read by Ezekiel, it had become part of him. The message was now literally inside him, transformed from external words on a page to internal conviction and calling. This wasn't just about memorizing a message or understanding concepts. Ezekiel had internalized God's word in the most complete way possible. Every word of judgment, every call to repentance, every promise of restoration was now as much a part of him as his own thoughts and feelings. After the incredible experience of eating the scroll, God gave Ezekiel one of the most sobering responsibilities ever assigned to a human being. He was to become a watchman, not just any watchman, but a spiritual guardian responsible for the eternal welfare of God's people. In ancient times, watchmen stood on city walls or high towers, scanning the horizon for approaching danger. When they spotted enemies or threats, they would blow a warning trumpet to alert the city. The safety of everyone depended on the watchman's faithfulness and alertness. Now God was appointing Ezekiel to this same role, but in the spiritual realm. As recorded in Ezekiel chapter 3, verse 17, God said, "Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the people of Israel. So hear the word I speak and give them warning from me." This wasn't just about delivering messages. It was about bearing responsibility for people's spiritual safety and eternal destiny. God explained the weight of this responsibility with crystal clarity. If a wicked person was heading towards spiritual destruction and Ezekiel failed to warn them, their blood would be on Ezekiel's hands. In verses 18 and 19, the Lord said, "When I say to a wicked person, 'You will surely die,' and you do not warn them or speak out to dissuade them from their evil ways in order to save their life, that wicked person will die for their sin, and I will hold you accountable for their blood. But if you do warn the wicked person, and they do not turn from their wickedness or from their evil ways, they will die for their sin, but you will have saved yourself." The same principle applied to righteous people who might turn away from their faith. If they began to sin, and Ezekiel didn't warn them of the consequences, he would bear responsibility for their spiritual downfall. But if he faithfully delivered the warning, whether they listened or not, he would be free from their blood. This created an enormous burden of responsibility. Ezekiel wasn't just responsible for his own spiritual condition, he was accountable for everyone he was sent to warn. Their eternal destiny partly depended on his faithfulness in delivering God's messages. But with this great responsibility came great authority. God wasn't sending Ezekiel out empty-handed. Every warning, every call to repentance, every promise of restoration carried the full weight of divine authority behind it. When Ezekiel spoke God's words, he spoke with the same authority as God himself. God's methods of communication through Ezekiel were unlike anything seen before. Instead of just speaking words, God commanded Ezekiel to act out his messages through dramatic, symbolic performances that would capture people's attention and burn the truth into their memories. The first dramatic act began with something as simple as a brick. In Ezekiel chapter 4, verse 1, God commanded, "Now, son of man, take a block of clay, put it in front of you, and draw the city of Jerusalem on it." This wasn't just an art project. This was the beginning of a powerful visual prophecy. After drawing Jerusalem on the brick, Ezekiel was told to lay siege to it. He built siege works around it, erected earthworks, pitched camps, and set battering rams against it all around. Then he took an iron pan and placed it as an iron wall between himself and the city, turning his face toward it to show that it was under siege. But the performance was just beginning. God then gave Ezekiel an incredibly difficult command that would test his obedience to the limit. He was to lie on his left side for 390 days, bearing the sin of the people of Israel. Then he was to lie on his right side for 40 days, bearing the sin of Judah, 1 day for each year of their sin. During this entire time, Ezekiel was to keep his face turned toward the siege of Jerusalem and prophesy against it with his arm bared. God even bound him with ropes, so he couldn't turn from one side to the other until the days of his siege were completed. The food restrictions were equally extreme. Ezekiel was commanded to eat only about 8 ounces of food per day and drink, only about 2/3 of a quart of water. The food was to be made from a mixture of wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and spelt, the kind of mixture people would eat during a siege when normal food supplies were exhausted. Initially, God commanded Ezekiel to cook this food over human excrement, but when Ezekiel protested that he had never defiled himself with unclean food, God mercifully allowed him to use cow dung instead. This represented the unclean conditions the people would face during the siege of Jerusalem. Every aspect of this dramatic performance had meaning. The 390 days represented the years of Israel's sin. The 40 days represented Judah's sin. The limited food and water showed the conditions during the siege, and the unclean fuel represented the spiritual defilement that would come upon the people. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of Ezekiel's visions was witnessing something that had never happened before in Israel's history: the gradual departure of God's glory from the temple in Jerusalem. This wasn't a sudden abandonment, but a slow, reluctant withdrawal that showed God's patience even in judgment. The process began when Ezekiel was transported in vision to Jerusalem, specifically to the entrance of the north gate of the inner court of the temple. What he saw there broke his heart. As recorded in Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 3, he stretched out what looked like a hand and took me by the hair of my head. The Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven, and in visions of God he took me to Jerusalem. What Ezekiel witnessed in the temple was spiritual adultery of the worst kind. There was an idol at the entrance that provoked God to jealousy. Digging through a wall, he discovered a secret room where 70 elders of Israel were burning incense to carved images of detestable animals and creatures. At the entrance to the north gate, women were sitting and weeping for the false god Tammuz. In the inner court, 25 men had their backs turned to the temple of the Lord, worshipping the sun toward the east. The temple that was supposed to be the dwelling place of the Most High God had been turned into a center of pagan worship. The very leaders who should have been protecting the people's relationship with God were leading them into spiritual prostitution. It was in this context that God's glory began its slow departure. In chapter 9, verse 3, Ezekiel recorded, "Now the glory of the God of Israel went up from above the cherubim where it had been and moved to the threshold of the temple." This was the first movement. The glory that had rested above the ark of the covenant in the Holy of Holies moved to the doorway. The glory didn't leave immediately. It paused at the threshold as if reluctant to go, giving opportunity for repentance that never came. Then, in chapter 10, verse 4, the glory of the Lord rose from above the cherubim and moved to the threshold of the temple. The cloud filled. The temple and the court was full of the radiance of the glory of the Lord. The departure continued in stages. The glory moved from the threshold to the cherubim, and the cherubim lifted their wings. In verse 18, then the glory of the Lord departed from over the threshold of the temple and stopped above the cherubim. The living creatures Ezekiel had seen in his first vision were now carrying God's presence away from his own house. The final movement was the most devastating of all. In chapter 11, verse 23, Ezekiel witnessed, "The glory of the Lord went up from within the city and stopped above the mountain east of it." The glory that had filled Solomon's temple, that had led Israel through the wilderness, that had been the center of their worship and identity, was now departing completely. This wasn't God abandoning his people in anger. It was God being forced to leave because his holiness could no longer dwell in a place that had been so thoroughly defiled. The departure was gradual, giving multiple opportunities for repentance, but the people's hearts had become too hard to respond. The final aspect of Ezekiel's early ministry focused on the corrupt leadership that had led God's people astray. These weren't ordinary citizens making personal mistakes. These were the princes, priests, and leaders who held positions of trust and authority, yet used their power to lead people away from God. In Ezekiel chapter 11, verse 1, the Spirit lifted Ezekiel to the east gate of the Lord's house, where he saw 25 men, including Jaazaniah and Pelatiah, who were leaders among the people. But instead of leading righteously, they were plotting evil and giving wicked advice to the city. God revealed their thoughts to Ezekiel in verse 3. They say, "Haven't our houses been recently rebuilt? This city is a pot, and we are the meat in it." They believed they were safe, that Jerusalem was like a cooking pot that would protect them like meat protected in a vessel. Their confidence was in the city's walls and their own political schemes rather than in God's protection. These leaders had convinced themselves and others that they could continue in their rebellion without consequences. They thought their strategic location, their fortifications, and their political alliances would keep them safe. They had completely forgotten that their security had always come from their relationship with God, not from human strength. God commanded Ezekiel to prophesy against these corrupt leaders. In verse 4 he said, "Therefore prophesy against them, prophecy, Son of Man." The message was clear and devastating. Their schemes would fail, their confidence was misplaced, and judgment was coming. The judgment was swift and dramatic. While Ezekiel was prophesying, Pelatiah, son of Benaiah, died suddenly. This wasn't coincidence. It was a sign that God's words through Ezekiel carried immediate power and authority. The death of this leader served as a warning to all the others about the seriousness of their rebellion. The experience was so intense that Ezekiel fell face down and cried out, "Alas, sovereign Lord, will you completely destroy the remnant of Israel?" He was overwhelmed by the reality that God's judgments were not empty threats, but immediate realities. But even in judgment, God's heart of mercy was revealed. He explained that although he had scattered his people among the nations and countries, he himself would be a sanctuary for them in the countries where they had gone. The exile wasn't abandonment, it was discipline with a purpose. God promised restoration in verses 17 to 20. "I will gather you from the nations and bring you back from the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you back the land of Israel again. They will return to it and remove all its vile images and detestable idols. I will give them an undivided heart and put a new spirit in them. I will remove from them their heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh. Then they will follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. They will be my people, and I will be their God." The corrupt leaders had hearts of stone, but God promised to give his people hearts of flesh. Where there was division and rebellion, he would create unity and obedience. Where there was spiritual adultery, he would restore faithful relationship. The judgment on the leaders wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter of restoration and hope. After the incredible visions and symbolic acts of his calling, God commanded Ezekiel to perform another dramatic prophecy that would shake the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. This wasn't going to be comfortable or easy. It was going to be a living picture of the horror that was coming to Jerusalem. In Ezekiel chapter 12, verse 3, God gave Ezekiel a command that seemed almost impossible. Therefore, Son of man, pack your belongings for exile, and in the daytime, as they watch, set out and go from where you are to another place. Perhaps they will understand, though they are a rebellious people. Ezekiel was to pack his bags like a refugee, preparing to flee his homeland. But this wasn't just any packing. These were the belongings of someone going into exile, the few precious items a person could carry when forced to leave everything behind forever. The people watching would immediately understand what this meant, because many of them had already experienced this nightmare. During the day, while everyone could see him clearly, Ezekiel gathered his meager possessions. He packed only what an exile could carry, the bare essentials for survival in a foreign land. No luxuries, no family treasures, no comfortable reminders of home, just the basics needed to stay alive. But the real drama came in the evening. As recorded in verse 4, during the daytime, while they watch, bring out your belongings packed for exile. Then in the evening, while they are watching, go out like those who go into exile. This wasn't just about packing. This was about acting out the actual moment of forced departure. When evening came, Ezekiel did something that made everyone's blood run cold. Instead of walking out through the door like a normal person, he dug through the wall of his house with his own hands. This represented people so desperate to escape that they would break through walls rather than use doors, trying to avoid capture by enemy soldiers. With his belongings on his shoulder, Ezekiel covered his face and went out through the hole he had made in the wall. The covered face showed the shame and grief of exile, people too heartbroken to look back at what they were losing, too afraid to see what lay ahead. The next morning, God explained the meaning of this powerful drama. In verse 10, he said, "Say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. This prophecy concerns the prince in Jerusalem and all the Israelites who are there." This wasn't just about ordinary people. This was about their leaders, including the king himself. Ezekiel was told to explain in verse 11, "Say to them, I am assigned to you. As I have done, so it will be done to them. They will go into exile as captives." Every action Ezekiel had performed would be experienced by the people in Jerusalem. The packing, the wall breaking, the covered faces, the desperate escape, it would all become their reality. The prophecy became even more specific regarding their leader. In verse 12, God revealed, "The prince among them will put his things on his shoulder at dusk and leave, and a hole will be dug in the wall for him to go through. He will cover his face so that he cannot see the land." Even the king would experience this humiliation, fleeing like a common refugee through a hole in the wall. But the most devastating part was yet to come. God declared in verse 13, "I will spread my net for him, and he will be caught in my snare. I will bring him to Babylonia, the land of the Chaldeans, but he will not see it, and there he will die." The king would be captured, blinded, and taken to Babylon, where he would die without ever seeing the land of his captivity. While Ezekiel was faithfully delivering God's true messages through dramatic demonstrations, Jerusalem was plagued by false prophets who were telling people exactly what they wanted to hear. These weren't just mistaken religious teachers. They were dangerous deceivers, leading people toward destruction with lies disguised as divine revelation. In Ezekiel chapter 13, verse 2, God commanded Ezekiel to take action against these frauds. "Son of man, prophesy against the prophets of Israel who are now prophesying. Say to those who prophesy out of their own imagination, hear the word of the Lord." These so-called prophets weren't receiving visions from God. They were making up messages from their own minds. God's condemnation was swift and fierce. In verse 3, he declared, "This is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to the foolish prophets who follow their own spirit and have seen nothing. They claimed to have visions, but they had seen absolutely nothing from God. They were spiritual frauds, leading people astray with their own imaginations. These false prophets were compared to jackals among ruins in verse 4. Just as jackals scavenge in destroyed places without rebuilding anything, these prophets were feeding off the spiritual destruction of God's people without offering any real help or hope. They were parasites, not healers. The most tragic part was their timing. In verse 5, God revealed their true nature. You have not gone up to the breaches in the wall to repair it for the people of Israel, so that it will stand firm in the battle on the day of the Lord. When God's people needed true spiritual leadership, most desperately, these false prophets were nowhere to be found. They offered no real strength, no genuine protection, no actual solution to the crisis. Instead, they spoke lies and claimed divine authority for their deceptions. Verse 6 exposed their method. Their visions are false, and their divinations a lie. Even though the Lord has not sent them, they say, the Lord declares, and expect him to fulfill their words. They were putting words in God's mouth that he had never spoken, then expecting him to make their lies come true. But the false prophecy problem wasn't limited to men. There were also women who were practicing a form of spiritual deception that was equally dangerous. In verse 17, God commanded, "Now, Son of Man, set your face against the daughters of your people who prophesy out of their own imagination. Prophesy against them." These false prophetesses had developed an elaborate system of magical practices designed to trap people's souls. As described in verse 18, this is what the sovereign Lord says, "Woe to the women who sew magic charms on all their wrists and make veils of various lengths for their heads in order to ensnare people. Will you ensnare the lives of my people, but preserve your own lives?" They were creating physical objects, charms and veils that they claimed had spiritual power. People were paying them for these items, believing they would provide protection or spiritual insight. But these women were actually trapping people in deception, taking advantage of their spiritual hunger for personal gain. God revealed their mercenary motivation in verse 19. "You have profaned me among my people for a few handfuls of barley and scraps of bread. By lying to my people who listen to lies, you have killed those who should not have died and have spared those who should not live." They were selling false spiritual comfort to people heading toward judgment while failing. To warn those who truly needed to repent, the judgment against all these false spiritual leaders was absolute. In verse 20, God declared his intention to tear away their deceptive tools. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says, "I am against your magic charms with which you ensnare people like birds, and I will tear them from your arms. I will set free the people that you ensnare like birds." After exposing the false prophets, God gave Ezekiel a parable that would cut to the heart of Jerusalem's true spiritual condition. This wasn't a gentle metaphor. It was a devastating comparison that revealed how far God's chosen city had fallen from its intended purpose. In Ezekiel chapter 15, verse 2, God posed a question that seemed simple but carried profound implications. "Son of man, how is the wood of a vine different from that of a branch from any of the trees in the forest?" This question forced people to think about what made a vine special and valuable. Everyone knew the answer. A vine was valuable for only one thing: producing grapes. Unlike other trees that could be used for building or making tools, vine wood was soft, weak, and essentially useless for any practical construction purpose. Its entire value depended on its ability to bear fruit. God pressed the point further. In verse 3, "Is wood ever taken from it to make anything useful? Do they make pegs from it to hang things on?" The answer was obviously no. Nobody made furniture from vine wood. Nobody carved tools from it. Nobody even made simple pegs to hang things on. Vine wood was too weak and unreliable for any of these purposes. This led to the devastating application of the parable. Jerusalem was like a vine chosen by God specifically to bear spiritual fruit, to be a light to the nations, to demonstrate God's character to the world. But instead of producing the fruit it was created for, Jerusalem had become spiritually barren. And just as useless vine wood was only good for one thing, burning as fuel, Jerusalem in its fruitless state was only fit for God's consuming judgment. In verse 4, God made this clear, "And after it is thrown on the fire as fuel, and the fire burns both ends and chars the middle, is it then useful for anything?" The image became even more pointed. Even after vinewood was partially burned, it became completely worthless. The charred remains couldn't be used for anything at all. This represented Jerusalem's condition after experiencing God's partial judgments. Instead of repenting and returning to fruitfulness, the city had become even more hardened and useless. In verse 6, God applied the parable directly. "Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. As I have given the wood of the vine among the trees of the forest as fuel for the fire, so will I treat the people living in Jerusalem." Jerusalem's fate was sealed not because God was cruel, but because the city had failed to fulfill its purpose and had become spiritually worthless. The judgment wasn't arbitrary, it was the natural consequence of fruitlessness. Just as a farmer eventually removes a barren vine that takes up space without producing grapes, God was removing Jerusalem because it had failed to produce the spiritual fruit it was planted to bear. What came next was perhaps the most powerful and disturbing allegory in all of Scripture. God told Ezekiel to present Jerusalem's spiritual history as the story of an abandoned baby who grew up to become an unfaithful wife. This wasn't just a story. It was a raw, emotional account of betrayal that would make people understand the depth of their spiritual adultery. The story began with an image that would break any heart. In Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 4, God described Jerusalem's origins. "On the day you were born, your cord was not cut, nor were you washed with water to make you clean, nor were you rubbed with salt or wrapped in cloths. This was a baby completely abandoned, left to die without even the most basic care that any newborn needed to survive." Verse 5 painted an even more tragic picture. No one looked on you with pity or had compassion enough to do any of these things for you. Rather, you were thrown out into the open field, for on the day you were born, you were despised. This baby wasn't just neglected, she was actively rejected and thrown away like garbage. But then came the moment of divine rescue. In verse 6, God revealed his intervention. "Then I passed by and saw you kicking about in your blood, and as you lay there in your blood, I said to you, 'Live.'" Indeed, God didn't just walk by the dying infant. He commanded her to live and took personal responsibility for her survival. Under God's care, the abandoned baby began to thrive. Verse 7 described her growth. "I made you grow like a plant of the field. You grew and developed and entered puberty. Your breasts had formed and your hair had grown, yet you were still naked and bare." God had brought her from the brink of death to the beauty of young womanhood. When she reached maturity, God's relationship with her changed from guardian to husband. In verse 8, he declared, "Later I passed by, and when I looked at you and saw that you were old enough for love, I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your naked body. I gave you my solemn oath and entered into a covenant with you, and you became mine." This was the moment of their spiritual marriage, God choosing Jerusalem as his bride. The blessings that followed were extraordinary. God clothed her in the finest materials, embroidered cloth, leather sandals, fine linen, and costly garments. He adorned her with jewelry, bracelets, necklaces, rings, and a beautiful crown. He fed her the finest foods, honey, olive oil, and the best flour. She became incredibly beautiful and rose to become a queen among nations, but success corrupted her heart. In verse 15, the tragic turn began. But you trusted in your beauty and used your fame to become a prostitute. You lavished your favors on anyone who passed by, and your beauty became his. The very gifts God had given her became tools of spiritual adultery. The adultery wasn't just occasional unfaithfulness, it was systematic spiritual prostitution. She took the clothes God had given her and made shrines for false gods. She took the jewelry he had provided and made idols. She even took the food he supplied and offered it to other gods as incense. But the most horrifying aspect was yet to be revealed. In verse 20, God exposed the ultimate abomination. And you took your sons and daughters, whom you bore to me, and sacrificed them as food to the idols. Was your prostitution not enough? She had taken the children of her marriage with God and sacrificed them to false gods, the ultimate betrayal of trust and love. The allegory continued with devastating detail, showing how Jerusalem had actually paid other nations to be her lovers. Instead of being paid like a normal prostitute, she had reversed the natural order, giving gifts to her spiritual lovers instead of receiving them. God's next message came in the form of a riddle that would puzzle everyone who heard it, until Ezekiel explained its meaning. This wasn't just a nature story. It was a political prophecy disguised as a parable about eagles and trees. In Ezekiel chapter 17, verse 2, God commanded, "Son of man, set forth an allegory and tell it to the Israelites as a parable." What followed was a story that seemed simple on the surface, but contained layers of meaning that would reveal the political drama happening around them. The riddle began with a great eagle in verse 3. "Say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. A great eagle with powerful wings, long feathers, and full plumage of varied colors came to Lebanon. Taking hold of the top of a cedar, he broke off its topmost shoot and carried it away to a land of merchants, where he planted it in a city of traders." This great eagle represented Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, with his powerful military might. The cedar tree was the royal house of Judah, and the topmost shoot was King Jehoiakim, whom Nebuchadnezzar had carried away to Babylon in the first deportation. But the eagle didn't just take, he also planted. Verse 5 continued the story. "He took one of the seedlings of the land and put it in fertile soil. He planted it like a willow by abundant water, and it sprouted and became a low, spreading vine." This seedling was Zedekiah, whom Nebuchadnezzar had placed on the throne as a puppet king. The arrangement seemed to be working well. The vine grew and spread, but it remained low and under the control of the eagle that had planted it. This represented the tributary relationship where Judah would remain a kingdom but under Babylonian authority. However, the story took a dramatic turn in verse 7. "But there was another eagle, a great one with powerful wings and a lot of feathers. The vine now turned its roots toward him from the plot where it was planted and stretched out its branches to him for water." This second eagle was Egypt, and the vine turning toward it represented King Zedekiah's decision to seek Egyptian help in rebelling against Babylon. The question posed in verse 9 revealed the foolishness of this decision. Will it thrive? Will it not be uprooted and stripped of its fruit so that it withers? All its new growth will wither. It will not take a strong arm or many people to pull it up by the roots. The vine that tried to serve two eagles would be destroyed by both. God then revealed his personal involvement in this political drama. In verse 16 he declared, "As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, he shall die in Babylon, in the land of the king who put him on the throne, whose oath he despised and whose treaty he broke." Zedekiah's rebellion wasn't just against Nebuchadnezzar, it was against God himself, who had ordained the Babylonian king's authority. The judgment was swift and certain. Verse 20 proclaimed, "I will spread my net for him, and he will be caught in my snare. I will bring him to Babylon and execute judgment on him there, because he was unfaithful to me." God would personally ensure that the rebellious king faced justice for his oath-breaking and unfaithfulness. But the parable ended with hope. In verse 22, God promised, "This is what the sovereign Lord says. I myself will take a shoot from the very top of a cedar and plant it. I will break off a tender sprig from its topmost shoots and plant it on a high and lofty mountain." This represented God's promise to raise up a future king from David's line who would rule righteously. After delivering these harsh judgments against the nation as a whole, God revealed a principle that would revolutionize how people understood divine justice. This wasn't just about national consequences. It was about individual responsibility and the possibility of personal redemption, even in the midst of national judgment. The principle was introduced through a popular saying that people were using to excuse their situation. In Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 2, God addressed this excuse. "What do you people mean by quoting this proverb about the land of Israel? The parents eat sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge." People were claiming they were suffering for their ancestors' sins, not their own. God's response was absolute and final. In verse 3, he declared, "As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, you will no longer quote this proverb in Israel." The era of blaming previous generations was officially over. Each person would be held accountable for their own choices and actions. To illustrate this principle, God presented 3 generations of a family with different moral choices. The first generation was represented by a righteous man described. In verse 5, "Suppose there is a righteous man who does what is just and right." This man followed God's laws completely. He didn't worship idols, commit adultery, oppress others, or charge interest on loans. He fed the hungry, clothed the naked, and executed true justice. The verdict for this righteous man was clear in verse 9. "He follows my decrees and faithfully keeps my laws. That man is righteous. He will surely live, declares the sovereign Lord." His righteousness guaranteed his life and God's blessing. But then God presented the second generation, the son of this righteous man who chose a completely different path. In verse 10, the scenario changed. Suppose he has a violent son who sheds blood or does any of these other things. This son committed every sin his father had avoided: murder, adultery, oppression, robbery, and idolatry. The question was crucial. Would this wicked son be protected by his father's righteousness? God's answer was definitive in verse 13. "Will such a man live? He will not. Because he has done all these detestable things, he is to be put to death. His blood will be on his own head." Parental righteousness provided no protection for personal wickedness. The third generation completed the illustration. In verse 14, God presented another possibility. "But suppose this son has a son who sees all the sins his father commits, and though he sees them, he does not do such things." This grandson chose righteousness despite his father's terrible example. The grandson's fate was determined by his own choices, not his family history. Verse 17 declared, "He withholds his hand from mistreating the poor and takes no interest or profit from them. He keeps my laws and follows my decrees. He will not die for his father's sin. He will surely live." A wicked father couldn't condemn a righteous son any more than a righteous grandfather could save a wicked grandson. God summarized the principle with perfect clarity in verse 20. "The one who sins is the one who will die. The child will not share the guilt of the parent, nor will the parent share the guilt of the child. The righteousness of the righteous will be credited to them, and the wickedness of the wicked will be charged against them." But the most amazing part was the possibility of personal transformation. In verse 21, God revealed that even the most wicked person could change their destiny. But if a wicked person turns away from all the sins they have committed and keeps all my decrees and does what is just and right, that person will surely live. They will not die. Past sins didn't have to determine future fate. As Jerusalem's political situation deteriorated rapidly, God commanded Ezekiel to compose a funeral song for the royal family. This wasn't just poetry, it was a prophetic lament that would capture the tragedy of leadership that had failed to protect God's people. In Ezekiel chapter 19, verse 1, God gave the command, "Take up a lament concerning the princes of Israel." This was to be a mourning song, the kind sung at funerals when great leaders died. But these princes weren't dead yet. This was a prophecy of their coming doom. The lament began with a powerful metaphor in verse 2. "What a lioness was your mother! Among the lions, she lay down among young lions and reared her cubs." The mother lioness represented the royal line of David, specifically the kingdom of Judah. She was strong and noble, raising her young among other powerful leaders. The first cub grew to become a fearsome predator. Verse 3 described his development. She brought up one of her cubs, and he became a strong lion. He learned to tear the prey, and he became a man-eater. This represented King Jehoahaz, who ruled for only 3 months before being captured, but his reign was cut short by foreign intervention. In verse 4, the lament continued. The nations heard about him, and he was trapped in their pit. They led him with hooks to the land of Egypt. Jehoahaz was taken captive by Pharaoh Necho and died in Egyptian exile, never to return to his homeland. The lioness didn't give up after losing her first cub. Verse 5 told of her next attempt. When she saw her hope unfulfilled, her expectation gone, she took another of her cubs and made him a strong lion. This second cub was Jehoiakim, who seemed destined for greater success than his predecessor. This second lion also became powerful and dangerous. Verse 6 described his reign. He prowled among the lions, for he had become a strong lion. He learned to tear the prey, and he became a man-eater. Like his predecessor, he ruled with violence and oppression, devouring his own people. His destructive behavior extended beyond just personal violence. Verse 7 revealed the scope of his damage. He broke down their strongholds and devastated their towns. The land and all who were in it were terrified by his roaring. This king destroyed the very infrastructure and communities he was supposed to protect. But his fate was even worse than the first cubs. In verse 8, the lament described his capture. Then the nations came against him, those from regions round about. They spread their net for him, and he was trapped in their pit. Unlike the first king who was taken by one nation, this one faced a coalition of enemies. The end was swift and final. Verse 9 completed his story. With hooks they pulled him into a cage and brought him to the king of Babylon. They put him in prison, so his roar was heard no longer on the mountains of Israel. Jehoiakim was taken to Babylon in chains, and his voice of authority was silenced forever. The lament then shifted metaphors, comparing the royal line to a vine that had once been fruitful and strong. Verse 10 painted a picture of former glory. Your mother was like a vine in your vineyard planted by the water. It was fruitful and full of branches because of abundant water. This represented the kingdom during its prosperous years, but success led to pride and destruction. Verse 12 described the catastrophe, but it was uprooted in fury and thrown to the ground. The east wind made it shrivel. It was stripped of its fruit. Its strong branches withered and fire consumed them. The east wind represented the Babylonian invasion that would destroy everything. The final image was one of complete desolation. Verse 13 concluded the lament. Now it is planted in the desert, in a dry and thirsty land. The royal vine that had once flourished by abundant water was now withering in exile, far from the source of its strength and life. For the final symbolic act in this section, God gave Ezekiel one of the most vivid and disturbing metaphors yet. Jerusalem wasn't just a city under siege. It was like a cooking pot that had become so corroded and filthy that it could never be cleaned again. The prophecy came with a specific date in Ezekiel chapter 24, verse 1. In the 9th year, in the 10th month on the 10th day, the word of the Lord came to me. This wasn't just any day. This was the exact day that Nebuchadnezzar began his final siege of Jerusalem. While the attack was starting hundreds of miles away, God was revealing it to Ezekiel in real time. God commanded Ezekiel to record this date in verse 2. Son of man, record this date, this very date, because the king of Babylon has laid siege to Jerusalem this very day. This prophecy would serve as proof that God knew exactly what was happening and when. The metaphor began simply enough in verse 3. Tell this rebellious people a parable and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Put on the cooking pot. Put it on and pour water into it. At first, this seemed like normal cooking preparation, but as the instructions continued, the true meaning became clear. Verse 4 revealed what was going into the pot. Put into it the pieces of meat, all, the choice pieces, the leg and the shoulder. Fill it with the best of these bones. The meat represented the people of Jerusalem, and the best pieces represented the nobility and leadership. The cooking process began in verse 5. Take the pick of the flock, pile wood beneath it for the bones, bring it to a boil and cook the bones in it. This was the siege of Jerusalem. The city was being heated by the fires of war, and everyone inside was being cooked by the pressure and violence. But then God revealed the real problem with this pot. In verse 6 he declared, for this is what the sovereign Lord says, woe to the city of bloodshed, to the pot now encrusted, whose deposit will not go away. Take the meat out piece by piece in whatever order it comes. The pot was corroded with rust and deposits that couldn't be cleaned. The rust and corrosion represented the accumulated bloodshed and sin that had built up in Jerusalem over generations. Just as rust weakens metal and makes it unusable, the moral corruption had weakened the city beyond repair. Verse 7 identified the source of this corruption. For the blood she shed is in her midst. She poured it on the bare rock. She did not pour it on the ground, where the dust would cover it. The city had committed murders so openly and brazenly that the blood cried out for vengeance. The judgment was both just and inevitable. In verse 8, God explained his response. To stir up wrath and take revenge, I put her blood on the bare rock so that it would not be covered. God himself had ensured that Jerusalem's crimes would not be hidden or forgotten. The corruption was so complete that normal cleaning wouldn't work. Verse 11 described the drastic measures needed. Then set the empty pot on the coals till it becomes hot and its copper glows, so that its impurities may be melted and its deposit burned away. The only way to deal with this level of corruption was to heat the pot until the metal itself glowed and the rust was burned away. But even this extreme treatment failed. Verse 12 revealed the hopeless condition. It has frustrated all efforts. Its heavy deposit has not been removed, not even by fire. The corruption was so deep and complete that even the most intense purification couldn't clean it. The final verdict was devastating in verse 13. Now your impurity is lewdness, because I tried to cleanse you, but you would not be cleansed from. Your impurity you will not be clean again until my wrath against you has subsided. The pot was beyond redemption and would have to be completely destroyed. After delivering devastating prophecies against Jerusalem, God's attention turned to the nations surrounding Israel. These weren't random judgments against distant peoples. They were targeted pronouncements against specific neighbors who had celebrated Jerusalem's downfall and taken advantage of God's people in their darkest hour. The first nation to face judgment was Ammon, located east of the Jordan River. In Ezekiel chapter 25, verse 2, God commanded, "Son of man, set your face against the Ammonites and prophesy against them." The Ammonites were descendants of Lot, making them distant relatives of Israel, but they had shown no family loyalty when Jerusalem fell. Their crime was revealed in verse 3. "Say to them, hear the word of the sovereign Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Because you said, 'Aha,' over my sanctuary when it was desecrated, and over the land of Israel when it was laid waste, and over the people of Judah when they went into exile." The Ammonites had actually celebrated when God's temple was destroyed and his people were dragged away in chains. This wasn't just political rivalry, it was spiritual mockery. They had rejoiced when the place where God's name dwelt was defiled and destroyed. Their aha was a cry of triumph over what they saw as the defeat of Israel's God, not just Israel's army. The punishment would fit the crime perfectly. In verse 4, God declared, "Therefore I'm going to give you to the people of the east as a possession. They will set up their camps and pitch their tents among you. They will eat your fruit and drink your milk." The very people the Ammonites thought would protect them would instead consume everything they had. Their capital city would become a pasture for animals. In verse 5, "I will turn Rabbah into a pasture for camels, and Ammon into a resting place for sheep. Then you will know that I am the Lord." The city where they had celebrated Israel's destruction would become grazing land for wandering herds. Next came Moab, another descendant nation of Lot. Their sin was different but equally serious. In verse 8, God revealed their offense. "This is what the sovereign Lord says, because Moab and Seir said, 'Look, Judah has become like all the other nations.'" Moab had denied the uniqueness of God's relationship with his people, claiming Judah was no different from any pagan nation. This was a direct attack on God's character and covenant faithfulness. By saying Judah was just like other nations, Moab was essentially claiming that the God of Israel was powerless and no different from the false gods of other peoples. The judgment against Moab would expose the flank of their country in verse 9. "Therefore I will expose the flank of Moab, beginning at its frontier towns, Beth-Jeshimoth, Baal-Meon, and Kiriathaim, the glory of that land." Their strongest defensive positions would be stripped away, leaving them vulnerable to invasion. Edom's judgment was perhaps the most personal of all. These were the descendants of Esau, Jacob's twin brother, making them the closest blood relatives Israel had among the nations. But their behavior during Jerusalem's crisis had been absolutely brutal. Their crime was revealed in verse 12. "This is what the sovereign Lord says, because Edom took revenge on Judah and became very guilty by doing so." When Judah was already suffering under Babylonian attack, Edom had taken the opportunity to settle old scores and inflict additional damage on their wounded relatives. This wasn't just opportunistic raiding, it was calculated revenge that showed a deep hatred that had been festering for generations. They had waited for their moment of weakness and then struck with vicious cruelty. God's response would be equally personal and devastating. In verse 13, he declared, "Therefore this is what the sovereign Lord says, I will stretch out my hand against Edom and kill both man and beast. I will lay it waste, and from Teman to Dedan they will fall by the sword." The entire nation would be devastated from north to south. But the most shocking aspect of Edom's punishment was who would carry it out. Verse 14 revealed, "I will take vengeance on Edom by the hand of my people Israel, and they will deal with Edom in accordance with my anger and my wrath. They will know my vengeance, declares the sovereign Lord." Israel themselves would eventually be God's instrument of revenge against their treacherous relatives. The final neighbor to face judgment was the Philistines, the ancient enemies who lived along the Mediterranean coast. Their crime was described in verse 15. This is what the sovereign Lord says, because the Philistines acted in vengeance and took revenge with malice in their hearts, and with ancient hostility sought to destroy Judah. Like Edom, they had used Judah's weakness as an opportunity to settle ancient grudges. The phrase ancient hostility pointed to centuries of conflict between these peoples. From the days of Samson and David, the Philistines had been persistent enemies of God's people. Now they thought they saw their chance to finish what they had started long ago, but their celebration would be short-lived. In verse 16, God pronounced their doom. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says, I am about to stretch out my hand against the Philistines, and I will wipe out the Kerethites and destroy those remaining along the coast. The coastal cities that had been centers of Philistine power for centuries would be completely eliminated. Among all the nations that would face God's judgment, none was more powerful or prestigious than Tyre. This wasn't just another city-state. Tyre was the crown jewel of ancient commerce, a maritime empire that controlled trade routes across the Mediterranean Sea and had grown fabulously wealthy from its strategic position. The prophecy against Tyre began with the same attitude that had condemned the other nations. In Ezekiel chapter 26, verse 2, God revealed their response to Jerusalem's fall. Son of man, because Tyre has said of Jerusalem, Aha, the gate to the nations is broken, and its doors have swung open to me. Now that she lies in ruins, I will prosper. And Tyre saw Jerusalem's destruction as a business opportunity. Jerusalem had been a major commercial center, controlling important trade routes between Africa, Asia, and Europe. With Jerusalem out of the way, Tyre expected to capture all that lost business and become even richer. They were celebrating the death of a competitor rather than mourning the suffering of fellow human beings. This mercenary attitude toward human tragedy would bring divine judgment unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. In verse 3, God declared, Therefore this is what the sovereign Lord says, I am against you, Tyre, and I will bring many nations against you like the sea casting up its waves. The metaphor of waves was particularly appropriate for Tyre, since the city was built partly on an island and partly on the mainland coast. Just as relentless waves eventually wear down the strongest rock, wave after wave of enemy armies would crash against Tyre until nothing remained. The first wave would be the most devastating. In verse 7, God identified the primary attacker. For this is what the sovereign Lord says. From the north I am going to bring against Tyre Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, king of kings, with horses and chariots, with horsemen and a great army. The same Babylonian army that destroyed Jerusalem would turn its attention to Tyre. Nebuchadnezzar's siege methods were described in terrifying detail in verse 8. He will ravage your settlements on the mainland with the sword. He will set up siege works against you, build a ramp up to your walls and raise his shields against you. The mainland portion of Tyre would fall first, providing a base for attacking the island fortress. The assault would be overwhelming in its scope and violence. Verse 9 continued, He will direct the blows of his battering rams against your walls and demolish your towers with his weapons. The famous walls of Tyre, which had protected the city for centuries, would crumble under the relentless Babylonian attack. The aftermath would be even more devastating than the battle itself. In verse 10, God described the occupation. His horses will be so many that they will cover you with dust. Your walls will tremble at the noise of the war horses, wagons, and chariots when he enters your gates, as men enter a city whose walls have been broken through. The complete destruction was described in verse 12. They will plunder your wealth and loot your merchandise. They will break down your walls and demolish your fine houses and throw your stones, timber, and rubble into the sea. Everything that had made Tyre great, its buildings, its wealth, its very foundations, would be cast into the waters. The final image was one of absolute desolation. In verse 14, God declared, "I will make you a bare rock, and you will become a place to spread fish nets. You will never be rebuilt, for I, the Lord, have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord." The mighty commercial empire would be reduced to a bare rock where fishermen dried their nets. But Tyre's fall would have implications far beyond the city itself. The economic shockwaves would be felt throughout the ancient world. In verse 15, God revealed the broader impact. This is what the sovereign Lord says to Tyre. Will not the coastlands tremble at the sound of your fall, when the wounded groan, and the slaughter takes place in you? The smaller coastal cities that depended on Tyre's trade networks would be terrified, realizing that if mighty Tyre could fall, no city was safe. Their economic lifeline was being cut, and they would have to find new ways to survive in a world without Tyrian commerce. The princes of the sea, the rulers of other maritime cities, would perform elaborate mourning rituals. Verse 16 described their response. Then all the princes of the coastlands will step down from their thrones and lay aside their robes and take off their embroidered garments. Clothed with terror, they will sit on the ground, trembling every moment, appalled at you. After prophesying the political and economic destruction of Tyre, God commanded Ezekiel to compose a funeral dirge for the king of Tyre. But this wasn't just about an earthly ruler. This lament would reveal spiritual realities that went far beyond human politics and reach into the very origins of evil itself. The lament began with what seemed like excessive praise for a human king. In Ezekiel chapter 28 verse 12, God commanded, "Son of man, take up a lament concerning the king of Tyre and say to him, this is what the sovereign Lord says, you were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty." Oh, no human ruler had ever been described in such absolute terms. The description continued with even more extraordinary language in verse 13. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone adorned you, carnelian, chrysolite and emerald, topaz, onyx and jasper, lapis lazuli, turquoise and beryl. Your settings and mountings were made of gold. On the day you were created, they were prepared. This being had been present in the original Garden of Eden, adorned with precious stones and created by God himself. The revelation became even more astounding in verse 14. You were anointed as a guardian cherub, for so I ordained you. You were on the holy mount of God. You walked among the fiery stones. This wasn't describing any human king. This was describing a powerful angelic being who had held one of the highest positions in God's heavenly court. This guardian cherub had originally been perfect in every way. Verse 15 confirmed, you were blameless in your ways from the day you were created till wickedness was found in you. There had been a time when this being was completely without sin, fulfilling his role as God's appointed guardian with perfect obedience and righteousness. But something had gone terribly wrong. The perfection had been corrupted from within, and the change was connected to the same thing that had corrupted Tyre, commercial success and pride. Verse 16 revealed the process. Through your widespread trade, you were filled with violence, and you sinned. So I drove you in disgrace from the mount of God, and I expelled you, guardian cherub, from among the fiery stones. The root of the corruption was identified in verse 17. Your heart became proud on account of your beauty, and you corrupted your wisdom because of your splendor. So I threw you to the earth. I made a spectacle of you before kings. Pride in his own beauty and wisdom had transformed this perfect being into a rebel against his creator. The judgment that followed was total and irreversible. In verse 18, God declared, "By your many sins and dishonest trade, you have desecrated your sanctuaries. So I made a fire come out from you, and it consumed you, and I reduced you to ashes on the ground in the sight of all who were watching." The fire of judgment would come from within, consuming everything this being had been and accomplished. The final verdict was absolute in verse 19. "All the nations who knew you are appalled at you. You have come to a horrible end and will be no more." This powerful being who had once walked in God's presence would be completely destroyed, becoming a source of horror and warning to all who witnessed his fate. This lament revealed that the human king of Tyre was being used as an earthly representation of a much greater spiritual reality. The pride, corruption, and fall of the earthly king paralleled the ancient rebellion of this guardian cherub, who had fallen from heaven through pride and become an enemy of God. After the elaborate prophecies against Tyre and its king, God's attention turned to Sidon, Tyre's northern neighbor and partner in maritime commerce. But the prophecy against Sidon was shorter and served as a bridge to something much more hopeful, the promise of Israel's eventual restoration. In Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 21, God commanded, "Son of man, set your face against Sidon, prophesy against her." Sidon was an ancient Phoenician city that had been a center of trade and pagan worship for over 1,000 years. Like Tyre, it had profited from relationships with various nations while maintaining its independence through commercial power. The judgment against Sidon was swift and direct. In verse 22, God declared, "This is what the sovereign Lord says, I am against you, Sidon, and among you I will display my glory. You will know that I am the Lord when I inflict punishment on you, and within you am proved to be holy." Unlike the detailed description of Tyre's fall, Sidon's judgment was presented as a demonstration of God's holiness and power. The method of judgment was described in verse 23. "I will send a plague upon you and make blood flow in your streets. The slain will fall within you, with the sword against you on every side. Then you will know that I am the Lord." Disease and warfare would combine to devastate the city, proving that no amount of commercial success could provide protection against divine judgment. But immediately after pronouncing judgment on Sidon, God shifted to a message of hope for Israel. This wasn't coincidental. It was a deliberate contrast between the fate of those who opposed God's people and the future that awaited God's chosen nation despite their current suffering. In verse 24, God addressed Israel's situation. "No longer will the people of Israel have malicious neighbors who are painful briars and sharp thorns. Then they will know that I am the sovereign Lord." All the neighboring nations that had tormented Israel throughout their history would be removed as sources of temptation and oppression. The promise of restoration was comprehensive and wonderful. Verse 25 declared, "This is what the sovereign Lord says, when I gather the people of Israel from the nations where they have been scattered, I will be proved holy through them in the sight of the nations. Then they will live in their own land, which I gave to my servant Jacob." This gathering wouldn't just be a return to geography, it would be a return to their covenant relationship with God. They would once again demonstrate God's holiness to the watching world, not through their rebellion and punishment as they had been doing, but through their restoration and blessing. The restoration would include both security and prosperity. In verse 26, God promised, "They will live there in safety and will build houses and plant vineyards. They will live in safety when I inflict punishment on all their neighbors who maligned them. Then they will know that I am the Lord their God." The safety would come not from military might or political alliances, but from God's protection after he dealt with all their enemies. This promise served as a crucial reminder that God's judgments against the nations weren't motivated by favoritism or ethnic preference. They were the result of these nations' treatment of God's people and their rejection of divine justice. When God restored Israel, it would be as a demonstration of his faithfulness to his covenant promises, not as a reward for Israel's perfect behavior. Of all the nations that would face God's judgment, none was more significant than Egypt. This wasn't just another neighboring country. Egypt was a world superpower, the ancient center of civilization and the nation that had enslaved God's people for 400 years before the Exodus. The prophecies against Egypt would span multiple chapters and reveal God's sovereignty over even the mightiest earthly powers. The word against Egypt came with specific dating in Ezekiel chapter 29, verse 1. In the 10th year, in the 10th month on the 12th day, the word of the Lord came to me. This precision showed that God's timing was exact and his knowledge of international events was perfect. God commanded Ezekiel to deliver this message in verse 2. Son of man, set your face against Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and prophesy against him, and against all Egypt. This wasn't just about the current ruler, it was about the entire Egyptian system of power that had dominated the ancient world for millennia. Egypt's primary sin was arrogance and self-deification. In verse 3, God revealed Pharaoh's attitude. Speak to him and say, "This is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, you great monster lying among your streams. You say, the Nile belongs to me. I made it for myself." Pharaoh claimed ownership and creation of the very river that gave Egypt life. This wasn't just political pride, it was religious blasphemy. By claiming to have made the Nile, Pharaoh was asserting divine power and denying God's role as creator. The Nile was Egypt's lifeline, and Pharaoh was claiming credit for the miraculous annual flood that made Egyptian civilization possible. The punishment would be both humiliating and devastating. In verse 4, God declared, "But I will put hooks in your jaws and make the fish of your streams stick to your scales. I will pull you out from among your streams with all the fish sticking to your scales." The great monster would be dragged out of his element like a caught fish, helpless and gasping. The imagery continued in verse 5, "I will leave you in the desert, you and all the fish of your streams. You will fall on the open ground and not be gathered or picked up. I will give you as food to the beasts of the earth and the birds of the sky." This represented complete defeat and abandonment with no proper burial or mourning. But God's case against Egypt went beyond just Pharaoh's arrogance. There was a specific betrayal that had sealed their doom. In verse 6, God explained, "Then all who live in Egypt will know that I am the Lord. You have been a staff of reed for the people of Israel." Egypt had failed as an ally when Israel needed support most. The metaphor of the reed staff was devastating in verse 7. "When they grasped you with their hands, you splintered and you tore open their shoulders. When they leaned on you, you broke and their backs were wrenched." Instead of providing the military support they had promised, Egypt had collapsed under pressure and caused additional injury to those who trusted them. This had happened repeatedly throughout Israel's history. Whenever Israel faced a crisis and turned to Egypt for help instead of trusting God, Egypt had proven unreliable and had often made the situation worse. They had been a false hope that led to disappointment and disaster. The judgment would be comprehensive and long-lasting. In verse 8, God declared, "Therefore this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will bring a sword against you and kill both man and beast." This wouldn't just be a political defeat, it would be a demographic catastrophe that would reduce Egypt's population drastically. The desolation would last for decades. Verse 10 specified the duration. "Therefore I am against you, and against your streams, and I will make the land of Egypt a ruin and a desolate waste from Migdol to Aswan, as far as the border of Cush." From the Mediterranean coast to the southern border, the entire country would become uninhabitable. The most shocking aspect was the complete depopulation described in verse 11. The foot of neither man nor beast will pass through it. No one will live there for 40 years. For an entire generation, Egypt would be as empty as a desert, with no human or animal life surviving in what had been one of the most densely populated regions on earth. But like the other judgments, this one had a redemptive purpose. After 40 years of desolation, God would restore Egypt, though not to its former glory. Verse 13 promised, "Yet this is what the sovereign Lord says. At the end of 40 years, I will gather the Egyptians from the nations where they were scattered." Even God's enemies would eventually experience mercy and restoration. 2 years after the first prophecy against Egypt, God gave Ezekiel another vision that portrayed Pharaoh in an even more dramatic and terrifying way. This time, the Egyptian ruler wasn't just a reed or a monster. He was depicted as a massive crocodile that terrorized the waters, but would ultimately be trapped and destroyed. The second prophecy came with its own date in Ezekiel chapter 32, verse 1. "In the 12th year, in the 12th month, on the first day, the word of the Lord came to me." This was near the end of Ezekiel's prophetic ministry, showing that God's attention to Egypt's fate continued throughout the entire period of Jerusalem's crisis. The new metaphor was introduced in verse 2. "Son of man, take up a lament concerning Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and say to him, you are like a lion among the nations. You are like a monster in the seas, thrashing about in your streams, churning the water with your feet and muddying the streams." Pharaoh saw himself as a noble lion, but God saw him as a destructive sea monster. The crocodile imagery was particularly appropriate for Egypt, since the Nile was famous for its dangerous crocodiles that could kill unwary travelers or animals that came to drink. Pharaoh was like the largest and most dangerous of these predators, dominating his territory through fear and violence. But this great predator would face a hunter far more powerful than himself. In verse 3, God declared, "This is what the sovereign Lord says, with a great throng of people I will cast my net over you, and they will haul you up in my net." The image was of fishermen working together to catch a creature too large for any individual to handle. The capture would be both public and humiliating. Verse 4 continued, "I will throw you on the land and hurl you on the open field. I will let all the birds of the sky settle on you, and all the animals of the wild gorge themselves on you." The mighty river predator would become carrion for scavengers. The scale of destruction would be unprecedented. In verse 5, God revealed, "I will spread your flesh on the mountains and fill the valleys with your remains." This hyperbolic language emphasized that Pharaoh's downfall would affect the entire landscape of Egypt and surrounding regions. The blood imagery became even more intense in verse 6. "I will drench the land with your flowing blood all the way to the mountains, and the ravines will be filled with your flesh." This represented not just Pharaoh's death, but the deaths of all his armies and supporters in a massive military catastrophe. Even the heavens would be affected by this earthly judgment. Verse 7 declared, "When I snuff you out, I will cover the heavens and darken their stars. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon will not give its light." This cosmic imagery showed that Pharaoh's fall would be an event of universal significance. The terror would spread far beyond Egypt's borders. In verse 9, God revealed, "I will trouble the hearts of many peoples when I bring about your destruction among the nations, among lands you have not known." Even distant countries that had never dealt directly with Egypt would be shaken by news of such a powerful empire's collapse. Kings everywhere would tremble at the implications. Verse 10 described their reaction. "I will cause many peoples to be appalled at you, and their kings will shudder with horror because of you when I brandish my sword before them. On the day of your downfall, each of them will tremble every moment for his life." If Egypt could fall, no nation was safe from divine judgment. The specific weapon of destruction would be identified in verse 11. For this is what the sovereign Lord says, the sword of the king of Babylon will come against you. Nebuchadnezzar, who had already destroyed Jerusalem and Tyre, would also be the instrument of Egypt's humiliation. The final prophecy against Egypt was perhaps the most haunting of all. It depicted the proud empire descending into the realm of the dead, where it would join other fallen nations in the darkness below the earth. This wasn't just about political defeat. It was about eternal consequences and the fate of all earthly powers that defy God. This ultimate prophecy came 2 weeks after the previous one, as recorded in Ezekiel chapter 32, verse 17. In the 12th year, on the 15th day of the month, the word of the Lord came to me. The rapid succession of these prophecies showed the urgency and intensity of God's judgment against Egypt. God commanded Ezekiel to perform a funeral ritual in verse 18. Son of man, wail for the hordes of Egypt, and consign to the earth below, both her and the daughters of the mighty nations, along with those who go down to the pit. This was a burial ceremony for a nation that wasn't dead yet, prophetically sealing their doom. The descent to Sheol was described in verse 19. Do you surpass others in beauty? Go down and be laid among the uncircumcised. Egypt's pride in its beauty and civilization would count for nothing in the realm of death, where all earthly distinctions disappeared. In the underworld, Egypt would encounter other fallen powers. Verse 22 revealed the first group. Assyria is there with her whole army. She is surrounded by the graves of all her slain, all who have fallen by the sword. The mighty Assyrian Empire, which had once terrorized the ancient world, was already waiting in the darkness. Each fallen nation was described with the same refrain about their former power and present humiliation. Verse 24 introduced another. Elam is there, with all her hordes around her grave. All of them are slain, fallen by the sword. All who had spread terror in the land of the living went down uncircumcised to the earth below. The pattern continued with more nations in verse 26. Meshech and Tubal are there, with all their hordes around their graves. All of them are uncircumcised, killed by the sword because they spread their terror in the land of the living. Each empire that had once inspired fear was now itself terrified and defeated. Even the ancient warriors of old were present. Verse 27 described them. But they do not lie with the fallen warriors of old, who went down to the realm of the dead with their weapons of war, their swords placed under their heads and their shields resting on their bones. Though these warriors also had terrorized the land of the living, there were different levels even in the realm of death. The prophecy became personal for Egypt's allies in verse 29. Edom is there, her kings and all her princes. Despite their power, they are laid with those killed by the sword. They lie with the uncircumcised, with those who go down to the pit. Egypt would be joined by nations that had trusted in their alliance with her. The final group mentioned was particularly relevant in verse 30. All the princes of the north and all the Sidonians are there. They went down with the slain in disgrace, despite the terror caused by their power. They lie uncircumcised with those killed by the sword, and bear their shame with those who go down to the pit. Even Egypt's commercial partners would share her fate. When Pharaoh arrived in this realm of the dead, he would find a strange comfort in discovering he wasn't alone. Verse 31 revealed his reaction. Pharaoh, he and all his army, will see them, and he will be consoled for all his hordes that were killed by the sword, declares the sovereign Lord. His consolation would come from realizing that all earthly powers eventually faced the same end. The final verdict sealed Egypt's doom in verse 32. Although I had him spread terror in the land of the living, Pharaoh and all his hordes will be laid among the uncircumcised with those killed by the sword, declares the sovereign Lord. The empire that had terrorized others would itself become a source of terror through its spectacular fall. The vision of Sheol that concluded the prophecies against Egypt wasn't just about one nation's fate. It was a comprehensive picture of the ultimate destiny of all earthly powers that set themselves against God. This underground realm was portrayed as a vast cemetery where the proud empires of history lay in eternal defeat and shame. The description of this realm revealed a hierarchy even in death. Some nations were buried with honor, maintaining some dignity even in defeat, while others were consigned to the deepest shame and disgrace. The uncircumcised were separated from those who had maintained some covenant relationship with God, showing that spiritual condition affected even the afterlife. The repeated phrase, "they spread terror in the land of the living," emphasized that these nations had all been characterized by their use of fear and violence to maintain power. They had built their empires through intimidation and military might, making others tremble before their armies and political influence. But in death, the tables were completely turned. Those who had caused terror were now themselves terrorized. Those who had made others tremble were now trembling. The very power they had used to dominate others had become the source of their eternal humiliation. The image of weapons buried with some warriors, but not others, suggested that there were different types of military honor. Some had fought with a code of conduct that earned them a measure of respect even from their enemies, while others had been so brutal and dishonorable that they deserved no recognition even in death. The presence of kings, princes, and entire armies in this realm showed that no level of earthly authority provided protection from divine judgment. Royal blood, political alliances, military might, and economic power all proved useless when faced with the consequences of defying the creator of the universe. The mention of specific nations, Assyria, Elam, Meshech, Tubal, Edom, and Sidon, created a comprehensive survey of the ancient world's power centers. Each had dominated their region for a time, inspiring fear and commanding respect, but all had ultimately fallen to the same fate that awaited Egypt. This vision served as both warning and comfort. It was a warning to any nation or ruler who thought they could defy God without consequences, showing that even the mightiest earthly powers were temporary and vulnerable. But it was also comfort to God's people, showing that their oppressors would eventually face justice and that no enemy of God's people would escape accountability forever. The cosmic scope of this judgment revealed that history itself was moving toward a divine conclusion where all accounts would be settled and all wrongs would be made right. The nations that had seemed so permanent and powerful were actually just temporary actors on a stage, controlled by eternal purposes beyond their understanding. After all the devastating prophecies of judgment against Jerusalem and the surrounding nations, God was ready to show Ezekiel something that would change everything. This wasn't going to be another vision of destruction. This was going to be the most spectacular demonstration of resurrection power the world had ever seen. In Ezekiel chapter 37 verse 1, something extraordinary happened. The hand of the Lord was on me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. God didn't just give Ezekiel a vision this time. He physically transported him to a place that would become the setting for the most incredible miracle in the entire book. This wasn't just any valley, and these weren't just a few scattered bones. As Ezekiel looked around, he saw something that made his heart sink. Verse 2 described what he witnessed. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. These weren't recent casualties of war. These were bones that had been bleaching in the sun for years, completely dried out and lifeless. The sight was overwhelming. Everywhere Ezekiel looked, there were human remains scattered across the valley floor. Skulls, rib cages, leg bones, arm bones, the remnants of what had once been a massive army or population, now reduced to sun-bleached skeletons with no flesh, no life, and certainly no hope of ever living again. Then God asked him a question that seemed to have an obvious answer. In verse 3, he asked me, "Son of man, can these bones live?" Any reasonable person looking at this scene would have immediately answered, absolutely not. These bones were beyond dead. They were completely desiccated, scattered, and had been lying there so long that any connection between them had been lost. But Ezekiel had learned something important during his years as a prophet. When God asked questions, the obvious human answer wasn't always the right answer. So instead of saying what seemed logical, Ezekiel gave the perfect response. "Sovereign Lord, you alone know." He was admitting that human understanding had limits, but God's power didn't. What happened next defied every law of nature and every expectation of what was possible. In verse 4, God commanded, "Prophesy to these bones and say to them, 'Dry bones, hear the word of the Lord.'" Ezekiel was being told to preach to a congregation of skeletons, to deliver a sermon to an audience that had no ears to hear. The message itself was incredible. Verse 5 contained God's promise to the bones. "This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life." God wasn't just promising to put the bones back together. He was promising to restore complete, living, breathing human beings. The process would be systematic and amazing. Verse 6 outlined the steps. "I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come on you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord." First, the skeletal structure would be rebuilt, then muscles and organs, then skin, and finally the breath of life itself. Ezekiel obeyed God's command and began preaching to the bones. What happened next was like watching the most incredible special effects movie ever made, except this was completely real. Verse 7 recorded the immediate response. "So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I was prophesying, there was a noise, a rattling sound, and the bones came together, bone to bone." The noise must have been incredible, thousands of bones rolling across the valley floor, finding their proper partners, and clicking into place with perfect precision. Skulls rolled to meet spinal columns, arm bones found shoulder sockets, leg bones connected to hip joints. In a matter of moments, the scattered remains had become complete skeletons, lying in formation across the valley floor. But that was just the beginning. Verse 8 continued the amazing transformation. "I looked, and tendons and flesh appeared on them, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. Now, instead of dry bones, there were perfect human bodies lying motionless in the valley. They looked like people who were sleeping, but they weren't breathing." God gave Ezekiel another command that seemed just as impossible as the first. In verse 9 he said, "Prophesy to the breath, prophesy, Son of Man, and say to it, 'This is what the sovereign Lord says. Come, breath, from the four winds, and breathe into these slain, that they may live.'" Now Ezekiel had to preach to the air itself, calling for the wind to come and give life to these perfectly formed but lifeless bodies. The response was immediate and spectacular. Verse 10 described the final miracle. "So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath entered them. They came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast army. Not only did they come alive, but they stood up at attention like soldiers ready for battle. The valley that had been a graveyard was now filled with a mighty army of living people." Then God explained what this incredible vision meant. These bones weren't just random dead people. They represented something very specific. In verse 11, God revealed, "Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say, 'Our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We are cut off.'" The vision was about God's people in exile, who felt as hopeless and lifeless as scattered bones. The Israelites in Babylon felt exactly like those dry bones. They had been cut off from their homeland, their temple was destroyed, their king was in chains, and their national identity seemed completely finished. They were saying things like, "We're as good as dead. Our nation is over. There's no hope for us to ever be a people again." But God had a message for them through this incredible vision. In verse 12, he declared, "Therefore prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. My people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel." What seemed impossible to them was not only possible, but absolutely certain from God's perspective. The restoration wouldn't just be political, it would be spiritual. Verse 13 promised, "Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord, when I open your graves and bring you up from them." They would experience God's power in such an unmistakable way that their faith would be completely renewed. But the most amazing promise was still to come. In verse 14, God revealed the ultimate purpose. "I will put my spirit in you, and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done it, declares the Lord." This wasn't just about returning to geography. It was about receiving new spiritual life that would make them truly God's people again. After the spectacular vision of resurrection, God gave Ezekiel another dramatic demonstration, but this one was simpler and more practical. It involved 2 pieces of wood and a message that would give hope to a people who had been divided for centuries. The demonstration began with a simple command in Ezekiel chapter 37, verse 16. "Son of man, take a stick of wood and write on it, belonging to Judah and the Israelites associated with him. Then take another stick of wood and write on it, belonging to Joseph, that is, to Ephraim and all the Israelites associated with him." Ezekiel was to prepare 2 wooden sticks, each representing one part of the divided kingdom. This division went back over 300 years to the time when Solomon's kingdom had split after his death. The northern kingdom, called Israel or Ephraim, had included 10 tribes and had been destroyed by Assyria. The southern kingdom, called Judah, had included 2 tribes and had just been destroyed by Babylon. For centuries, these 2 parts of God's people had been separate nations, often fighting against each other instead of working together. The next instruction was simple but profound. Verse 17 commanded, "Join them together into one stick, so that they will become one in your hand." Ezekiel was to hold the 2 sticks together so they appeared to be a single piece of wood. This visual demonstration would capture everyone's attention and make them ask what it meant. Sure enough, the people's curiosity was aroused. Verse 18 recorded their question. "When your people ask you, won't you tell us what you mean by this?" They could see that something significant was being communicated through this simple act, but they needed the interpretation. God's explanation was better than anything they could have imagined. In verse 19, he revealed, "Say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I'm going to take the stick of Joseph, which is in Ephraim's hand, and of the Israelite tribes associated with him, and join it to Judah's stick, making them a single stick of wood, and they will become one in my hand." God himself was going to reunify his divided people. The reunification wouldn't just be symbolic, it would be literal and permanent. Verse 21 promised, "I will take the Israelites out of the nations where they have gone. I will gather them from all around and bring them back into their own land." This would involve people who had been scattered not just to Babylon, but to many different countries over several centuries. The new unified nation would be completely different from the old divided kingdoms. Verse 22 declared, I will make them one nation in the land, on the mountains of Israel. There will be one king over all of them, and they will never again be two nations or be divided into two kingdoms. The political division that had weakened and eventually destroyed both kingdoms would never happen again. The spiritual transformation would be just as dramatic as the political reunification. Verse 23 promised, they will no longer defile themselves with their idols and vile images, or with any of their offenses, for I will save them from all their sinful backsliding, and I will cleanse them. They will be my people, and I will be their God. The idolatry that had caused the original division and both kingdoms' destruction would be completely eliminated. The leadership of this new unified nation would be perfect. Verse 24 revealed, my servant David will be king over them, and they will all have one shepherd. They will follow my laws and be careful to keep my decrees. This wasn't referring to the historical David coming back from the dead, but to a future king from David's family line who would rule with David's heart for God. This perfect king would establish a perfect kingdom. Verse 25 described the permanence of this arrangement. They will live in the land I gave to my servant Jacob, the land where your ancestors lived. They and their children and their children's children will live there forever, and David my servant will be their prince forever. This wouldn't be another temporary kingdom that would rise and fall like all the others. This would be an eternal kingdom. The relationship between God and his people would be restored to what it was always meant to be. Verse 26 promised, I will make a covenant of peace with them. It will be an everlasting covenant. I will establish them and increase their numbers, and I will put my sanctuary among them forever. Instead of the broken covenant that had led to judgment and exile, there would be an unbreakable covenant that would guarantee permanent blessing. The ultimate purpose was that the whole world would recognize God's relationship with his people. Verse 27 declared, my dwelling place will be with them. I will be their God, and they will be my people. And verse 28 concluded, then the nations will know that I, the Lord, make Israel holy, when my sanctuary is among them forever. The restored and unified people would become a testimony to all nations of God's faithfulness and power. Just when it seemed like the promises of restoration meant that God's people would live in peace forever, God revealed that there would be one final test. A massive invasion would come against the restored nation, but this attack would ultimately demonstrate God's power to the entire world and establish his people's security permanently. The prophecy began with God addressing the leader of this future invasion. In Ezekiel chapter 38 verse 2, God commanded, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Prophesy against him. This Gog wasn't a specific person that Ezekiel knew, but a future leader who would arise from the far north. God described Gog's intentions in verse 3. This is what the sovereign Lord says, I am against you, Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. This wasn't just a human political decision. This invasion would be motivated by forces that opposed God himself and his purposes for his people. The invasion force would be massive and international. Verse 4 described God's role in organizing. Iddah, I will turn you around, put hooks in your jaws and bring you out with your whole army, your horses, your horsemen fully armed, and a great horde with large and small shields, all of them brandishing their swords. Even though Gog would think he was making his own decisions, God would actually be directing events for his own purposes. The coalition would include nations from all directions. Verse 5 listed some of the participants. Persia, Cush, and Put will be with them, all with shields and helmets. These represented countries from the east, south, and west, showing that this would be a truly international effort against God's people. The northern forces were described in verse 6. Also, Gomer with all its troops, and Beth Togarmah from the far north with all its troops, the many nations with you. This coalition would include peoples from the distant north, representing the most remote and powerful nations of the earth. But the timing of this invasion was crucial. It wouldn't happen immediately after the people returned from exile. Verse 8 explained, "After many days you will be called to arms. In future years you will invade a land that has recovered from war, whose people were gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate. They had been brought out from the nations, and now all of them live in safety." This invasion would come after Israel had been fully restored and was living in peace and prosperity. The restored nation would be completely unprepared for war. Verse 11 described their vulnerable condition. "You will say, I will invade a land of unwalled villages. I will attack a peaceful and unsuspecting people, all of them living without walls and without gates and bars." The people would be so confident in their security that they wouldn't even have military defenses. Gog's motivation would be purely materialistic. Verse 12 revealed his thinking. "I will plunder and loot and turn my hand against the resettled ruins and the people gathered from the nations, rich in livestock and goods, living at the center of the land." He would see Israel's prosperity and decide to take it for himself. Other nations would notice the invasion, but wouldn't intervene. Verse 13 described their response. "Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish and all her villages will say to you, 'Have you come to plunder? Have you gathered your hoards to loot, to carry off silver and gold, to take away livestock and goods, and to seize much plunder?'" They would ask questions but wouldn't take action to help. The invasion would seem overwhelming from a human perspective. Verse 15 described the massive force. "You will come from your place in the far north, you and many nations with you, all of them riding on horses, a great horde, a mighty army." This wouldn't be a small raid. It would be the largest military force ever assembled against God's people. But God had his own plans for this invasion. Verse 16 revealed his purpose. "You will advance against my people Israel like a cloud that uncovers the land. In days to come, Gog, I will bring you against my land, so that the nations may know me when I am proved holy through you before their eyes." This attack would become an opportunity for God to demonstrate his power to the entire world. The battle itself would be unlike anything in human history. Verse 19 described God's intervention. "In my zeal and fiery wrath, I declare that at that time there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel." Natural disasters would be God's first weapon against the invaders. The supernatural intervention would intensify. Verse 22 listed the divine weapons. "I will execute judgment on him with plague and bloodshed. I will pour down torrents of rain, hailstones and burning sulfur on him and on his troops and on the many nations with him." God would use weather, disease, and fire from heaven to destroy the invasion force. The result would be complete victory for God's people without them having to fight at all. Verse 23 declared the ultimate purpose. "And so I will show my greatness and my holiness, and I will make myself known in the sight of many nations. Then they will know that I am the Lord." This battle would serve as the final proof of God's sovereignty over all earthly powers. After the spectacular defeat of Gog's invasion, the land of Israel would need to be thoroughly cleansed before God's people could fully enjoy their inheritance. This wouldn't just be a matter of cleaning up after a battle. It would be a comprehensive purification that would take years to complete and would transform the very spiritual atmosphere of the land. The aftermath of the battle was described. In Ezekiel chapter 39 verse 9, "Then those who live in the towns of Israel will go out and use the weapons for fuel and burn them up, the small and large shields, the bows and arrows, the war clubs and spears. For 7 years they will use them for fuel." The amount of military equipment left behind would be so massive that it would provide fuel for the entire nation for 7 years. This detail revealed several important things. First, the invasion force had been enormous, large enough to equip an entire nation with fuel for 7 years. Second, the weapons were made of materials that could be burned, showing that even in this future time, some warfare would still involve traditional materials rather than being completely technological. Third, the people would be so secure after this victory that they could afford to burn military equipment rather than storing it for future conflicts. The cleanup of human remains would be even more extensive than dealing with the weapons. Verse 11 described the burial process. On that day, I will give Gog a burial place in Israel, in the valley of those who travel east of the sea. It will block the way of travelers, because Gog and all his hordes will be buried there. So it will be called the Valley of Hamon-Gog. The number of bodies would be so great that they would create a physical obstacle for people trying to travel through the area. The burial would be a massive national project. Verse 12 explained the scope. For 7 months, the Israelites will be burying them in order to cleanse the land. It would take the entire nation working for 7 months just to bury all the dead invaders. This showed both the enormous size of the invasion force and the thoroughness required to properly cleanse the land. But even after 7 months of intensive burial work, the job wouldn't be completely finished. Verse 14 described the ongoing cleanup. People will be continually employed in cleansing the land. They will spread out across the land, and along with others, they will bury any bodies that are lying on the ground. Some bodies would be missed in the initial cleanup and would need to be found and buried later. The search would be systematic and careful. Verse 15 outlined the procedure. As they go through the land, anyone who sees a human bone will leave a marker beside it until the gravediggers have buried it in the valley of Hamon-Gog. No remains would be left unburied, ensuring that the land was completely cleansed from the defilement of death. The spiritual significance of this cleanup was enormous. In ancient times, contact with dead bodies made people ceremonially unclean and prevented them from participating in worship. Having thousands of unburied corpses scattered across the land would have made the entire country spiritually defiled and unfit for God's presence. The thoroughness of the purification showed that God intended his restored people to enjoy perfect fellowship with him in a completely holy land. There would be no spiritual obstacles, no unclean areas, no reminders of death and destruction to interfere with their worship and relationship with God. The cleanup would also serve as a permanent reminder of God's victory over his enemies. Every time someone passed the valley of Hamon-Gog, they would remember how God had defeated the greatest army ever assembled against his people. The burial site would become a monument to divine power and faithfulness. The birds and wild animals would also participate in the cleanup, but in a different way. Verse 17 described a gruesome feast. Son of man, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Call out to every kind of bird and all the wild animals. Assemble and come together from all around to the sacrifice I am preparing for you. The great sacrifice. On the mountains of Israel, there you will eat flesh and drink blood. The carrion-eating creatures would consume the remains that couldn't be properly buried. This wasn't just about practical cleanup, it was about demonstrating that those who opposed God would become food for scavengers. The mighty warriors who had marched proudly to battle would end up as meals for vultures and jackals. Their strength and pride would be reduced to nothing more than nourishment for the lowest creatures. The feast would include the highest ranks of the enemy forces. Verse 18 specified the menu. You will eat the flesh of mighty men and drink the blood of the princes of the earth as if they were rams and lambs, goats and bulls, all of them fattened animals from Bashan. Generals, kings, and nobles would all receive the same treatment, becoming food for animals. The abundance would be overwhelming. Verse 19 promised, At the sacrifice I am preparing for you, you will eat fat until you are glutted and drink blood. until you are drunk. There would be so many bodies that even the scavengers would be overwhelmed by the abundance. This graphic imagery served multiple purposes. It showed the completeness of God's victory, the humiliation of his enemies, and the thoroughness of the land's purification. No trace of the invasion would remain, except for the Memorial Valley and the 7 years' worth of fuel from their weapons. 25 years after Ezekiel's first vision by the Kibar River, God gave him the most detailed and elaborate vision of his entire prophetic ministry. This wasn't about judgment or restoration in general terms. This was a precise architectural blueprint for a temple that would surpass even Solomon's magnificent building in glory and significance. The vision began with another supernatural transportation. In Ezekiel chapter 40, verse 1, the date was carefully recorded. In the 25th year of our exile, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th day of the month, in the 14th year after the fall of the city, on that very day, the hand of the Lord was on me, and he took me there. This was exactly 25 years after Ezekiel had been taken into exile, and 14 years after Jerusalem's destruction. Ezekiel found himself in a completely different place than the Valley of Dry Bones. Verse 2 described his new location. In visions of God, he took me to the land of Israel and set me on a very high mountain, on whose south side were some buildings that looked like a city. He was back in the Promised Land, but everything was different from what he remembered. A mysterious figure was waiting for him there. Verse 3 introduced this being. He took me there, and I saw a man whose appearance was like bronze. He was standing in the gateway with a linen cord and a measuring rod in his hand. This wasn't an ordinary person. His bronze-like appearance suggested a supernatural being, possibly an angel, who had been appointed to give Ezekiel a tour of this new temple complex. The bronze man gave Ezekiel specific instructions in verse 4. The man said to me, "Son of man, look carefully and listen closely and pay attention to everything I'm going to show you, for that is why you have been brought here. Tell the people of Israel everything you see." This wasn't just a casual tour. Ezekiel was being commissioned to remember every detail and report it accurately to the exiles in Babylon. The first thing they measured was the outer wall that surrounded the entire temple complex. Verse 5 described it. I saw a wall completely surrounding the temple area. The length of the measuring rod in the man's hand was 6 long cubits, each of which was a cubit and a handbreadth. He measured the wall. It was 1 measuring rod thick and 1 rod high. The wall was approximately 10 feet thick and 10 feet high, creating a substantial barrier around the holy area. The attention to detail was extraordinary. Every gateway, every room, every pillar, every threshold was measured with precision. The east gate, which was the main entrance, was particularly elaborate. Verse 6 began its description. Then he went to the east gate. He climbed its steps and measured the threshold of the gate. It was 1 rod deep. Every step of the entrance process was carefully designed and precisely measured. The guard rooms inside the gates were identical in size and spacing. Verse 7 recorded their dimensions. The alcoves for the guards were 1 rod long and 1 rod wide, and the projecting walls between the alcoves were 5 cubits thick, and the threshold of the gate next to the portico facing the temple was 1 rod deep. These weren't random rooms. They were carefully planned spaces for specific functions. The inner court had its own set of gates that mirrored the outer gates, but were even more elaborate. Verse 28 described the south gate. Then he brought me into the inner court through the south gate, and he measured the south gate. It had the same measurements as the others. The symmetry and consistency showed that this was a carefully planned design, not a haphazard collection of buildings. The porticos around the inner court were especially impressive. Verse 31 noted one detail. Its portico faced the outer court. Palm trees decorated its jambs, and 8 steps led up to it. The palm trees weren't just decoration. They were symbols of righteousness and flourishing, showing that this temple was designed to promote spiritual growth and blessing. The rooms for preparing sacrifices were strategically located near the gates. Verse 38 described their purpose. A room with a doorway was by the portico in each of the inner gateways, where the burnt offerings were washed. Every aspect of temple worship was carefully planned and provided for. Even the musicians had their designated spaces. Verse 44 mentioned, outside the inner gate within the inner court were 2 rooms, one at the side of the north gate and facing south, and another at the side of the south gate and facing north. These rooms were specifically designed for the singers who would lead worship in the new temple. The measurements continued with the temple building itself. Verse 48 began the description of the main structure. He brought me to the portico of the temple and measured the jambs of the portico. They were 5 cubits wide on either side. The width of the entrance was 3 cubits on either side. Every dimension was precisely specified, showing that this wasn't a vague vision, but a detailed blueprint. The recording of all these measurements served several purposes. First, it showed that God cared about details and order in worship. Second, it demonstrated that this temple was designed by divine wisdom rather than human creativity. Third, it provided hope to the exiles that God had specific plans for their restoration that were as detailed and certain as these architectural specifications. After the exhaustive tour of the temple's architecture, Ezekiel witnessed something that surpassed even the spectacular vision of the Valley of Dry Bones. The glory of God, which he had seen departing from the old temple in stages, was now returning to fill the new sanctuary with even greater splendor than before. The vision of God's return began at the East Gate, which had special significance throughout Ezekiel's ministry. In Ezekiel chapter 43 verse 1, the scene was set, "Then the man brought me to the gate facing east." This was the same direction from which Ezekiel had seen the glory depart years earlier, and now it would be the direction from which glory would return. What Ezekiel saw coming from the east was beyond description. Verse 2 attempted to capture it. "And I saw the glory of the God of Israel coming from the east. His voice was like the roar of rushing waters, and the land was radiant with his glory." This wasn't just a bright light. This was the very presence of the Creator of the universe returning to dwell with his people. The sight immediately brought back memories of Ezekiel's earlier visions. Verse 3 recorded his recognition. "The vision I saw was like the vision I had seen when he came to destroy the city, and like the visions I had seen by the Kebar River, and I fell face down." This was the same glory that had called him to be a prophet, the same presence that had departed from Jerusalem, now returning in triumph. The glory didn't just hover outside the temple, it entered and filled the entire structure. Verse 4 described the magnificent entrance. "The glory of the Lord entered the temple through the gate facing east." The same gate through which the glory had departed was now the portal for its glorious return. The intensity of the divine presence was overwhelming. Verse 5 recorded what happened next. "Then the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple." The entire building was saturated with God's presence, just as Solomon's temple had been filled. At its dedication, but even more intensely, Ezekiel found himself prostrate before this incredible display of divine glory, just as he had been at his first vision. But this time, instead of receiving a commission to prophesy judgment, he was witnessing the fulfillment of restoration promises. The God who had been forced to depart because of his people's sin was now returning to dwell with them permanently. The voice that spoke to him came from inside the temple, showing that God had truly taken up residence there. Verse 6 recorded, While the man was standing beside me, I heard someone speaking to me from inside the temple. God was no longer speaking from a distance or through visions. He was speaking from his dwelling place among his people. The message was one of permanent establishment and eternal relationship. In verse 7, God declared, "Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place for the soles of my feet. This is where I will live among the Israelites forever. The people of Israel will never again defile my holy name, neither they nor their kings, by their prostitution and the funeral offerings for their kings at their death." This wouldn't be another temporary arrangement that could be broken by human sinfulness. The reason for this permanence was explained in the promise of transformation. God wasn't just returning to the same people who had defiled his previous temple. He was returning to a people who had been fundamentally changed. Their hearts had been renewed, their spirits had been regenerated, and their capacity for spiritual adultery had been removed. The contrast with the past was emphasized in verse 8. "When they placed their threshold next to my threshold and their doorposts beside my doorposts, with only a wall between me and them, they defiled my holy name by their detestable practices, so I destroyed them in my anger." The old temple had been contaminated by the proximity of pagan worship and royal corruption, but the new arrangement would be completely different. Verse 9 promised, "Now let them put away from me their prostitution and the funeral offerings for their kings, and I will live among them forever." The spiritual adultery that had characterized the past would be permanently eliminated. This return of God's glory wasn't just a restoration. It was an escalation. The presence would be more intense, more permanent, and more transformative than ever before. The people who experienced this would be changed by the encounter in ways that would make future rebellion impossible. With God's glory now filling the new temple, it was time to establish the regulations that would govern worship. In this holy place, these weren't just updated versions of the old laws. They were designed for a people who had been transformed and a temple that would never again be defiled. The first priority was ensuring that only appropriate people would be allowed to enter the sacred areas. In Ezekiel chapter 44, verse 6, God addressed the issue that had caused problems in the past. "Say to rebellious Israel, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Enough of your detestable practices, people of Israel." 9. The casual attitude toward holiness that had characterized the past would not be tolerated in the new temple. The specific problem was identified in verse 7. "In addition to all your other detestable practices, you brought foreigners uncircumcised, in heart and flesh into my sanctuary, desecrating my temple, while you offered me food, fat and blood, and you broke my covenant." Allowing unqualified people into sacred areas had been one of the major causes of the temple's defilement. The solution was strict access control. Verse 9 established the new policy. "This is what the sovereign Lord says. No foreigner uncircumcised in heart and flesh is to enter my sanctuary, not even the foreigners who live among the Israelites." Physical circumcision alone wasn't enough. There had to be spiritual circumcision as well, representing a genuine heart relationship with God. But the access restrictions weren't just about foreigners. Even among the Levites, there would be different levels of service based on their past faithfulness. Verse 10 addressed those who had been unfaithful. "The Levites who went far from me when Israel went astray, and who wandered from me after their idols, must bear the consequences of their sin." These unfaithful Levites would still have a role in the temple, but it would be limited. Verse 11 defined their duties. "They may serve in my sanctuary, having charge of the gates of the temple, and serving in it. They may slaughter the burnt offerings and sacrifices for the people and stand before the people and serve them." They could handle the physical work and assist the people, but they couldn't approach God's presence directly. However, those who had remained faithful would receive special privileges. Verse 15 identified this group, but the Levitical priests, who are descendants of Zadok and who guarded the duties of my sanctuary when the Israelites went astray from me, are to come near to minister before me. They are to stand before me to offer sacrifices of fat and blood, declares the sovereign Lord. The family of Zadok had remained loyal when others fell into idolatry, and their faithfulness would be rewarded. These faithful priests would have exclusive access to the most sacred duties. Verse 16 specified their privileges. They alone are to enter my sanctuary. They alone are to come near my table to minister before me and serve me as guards. Only they could approach the altar where God's presence dwelt most intensely. The clothing. Regulations for these priests were detailed and specific. Verse 17 began the dress code. When they enter the gates of the inner court, they are to wear linen clothes. They must not wear any woolen garment while ministering at the gates of the inner court or inside the temple. Linen was cooler and cleaner than wool, representing the purity required for God's service. The head coverings were particularly important. Verse 18 specified, they are to wear linen turbans on their heads and linen undergarments around their waists. They must not wear anything that makes them perspire. Sweating was associated with the curse of hard labor after the fall, and there would be no reminders of the curse in God's presence. When the priests finished their duties and returned to the outer court where regular people gathered, they had to change clothes completely. Verse 19 explained the procedure. When they go out into the outer court, where the people are, they are to take off the clothes they have been ministering in and are to leave them in the sacred rooms and put on other clothes, so that the people are not consecrated through contact with their garments. The holiness was so intense that even their clothing could transmit it to unprepared people. Personal grooming standards were also specified. Verse 20 established the rules. They must not shave their heads or let their hair grow long, but they are to keep the hair of their heads trimmed. Extreme hairstyles associated with pagan mourning rituals or ascetic practices were forbidden. Everything should be moderate and appropriate. Marriage restrictions ensured the priest's family life, supported their sacred duties. Verse 22 outlined the requirements. They must not marry widows or divorced women. They may only marry virgins of Israelite descent or widows of priests. Their marriages needed to be unquestionably pure and free from any moral complications. The priest's teaching role was emphasized as being just as important as their ritual duties. Verse 23 described this responsibility. They are to teach my people the difference between the holy and the common and show them how to distinguish between the unclean and the clean. The people needed constant instruction to maintain the spiritual standards required for God's presence among them. Legal responsibilities were also part of their duties. Verse 24 explained, in any dispute, the priests are to serve as judges and decide it according to my ordinances. They are to keep my laws and my decrees for all my appointed festivals. They are to keep my Sabbaths holy. They would be the final arbiters of religious law and practice. Property ownership rules for priests were designed to keep them focused on spiritual rather than material concerns. Verse 28 addressed their inheritance. I am to be the only inheritance the priests have. You are to give them no possession in Israel. I will be their possession. Instead of owning land like other Israelites, the priests would be supported by offerings and would depend completely on God for their needs. The festivals and sacrificial system would be restored, but with new meaning and power. Chapter 45 outlined the regulations for the various offerings, showing that worship would continue, but in a context of permanent divine presence, rather than the tentative relationship that had characterized the past. The Sabbath regulations were particularly emphasized. showing that rest and worship would be priorities in the restored community. Verse 17 of chapter 46 specified, "The prince is to provide the burnt offerings, grain offerings, and drink offerings at the festivals, the new moons, and the Sabbaths, at all the appointed festivals of Israel." Even the political leadership would be focused on facilitating worship rather than pursuing secular power. The final vision that God gave to Ezekiel was perhaps the most practical and hopeful of all. After seeing the temple rebuilt and worship restored, he was shown how the entire promised land would be redistributed among the 12 tribes in a way that would ensure justice, equality, and permanent peace. This wasn't just about returning to the old tribal territories that had existed before the exile. This was a completely new arrangement that would correct the inequalities and conflicts that had contributed to the nation's downfall. In Ezekiel chapter 47, verse 13, God introduced the new system. "This is what the sovereign Lord says. These are the boundaries of the land that you will divide among the 12 tribes of Israel as their inheritance, with 2 portions for Joseph." The distribution would be fundamentally different from the original conquest under Joshua. Instead of each tribe receiving territory based on their military success or political influence, everyone would receive equal portions arranged in orderly parallel strips across the land. This geometric precision showed that divine wisdom, rather than human politics, would determine the boundaries. The northern border was carefully defined in verse 15. "This is to be the boundary of the land. On the north side, it will run from the Great Sea by the Hethlon Road, past Libo Hamath to Zedad." The boundaries would be larger and more clearly defined than they had been in the past, ensuring that there would be no disputes about territorial limits. But before describing the tribal allocations, God revealed something that would transform the very nature of the land itself. In chapter 47, verse 1, Ezekiel was shown an incredible sight. "The man brought me back to the entrance to the temple, and I saw water coming out from under the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the temple faced east. The water was coming down from under the south side of the temple, south of the altar." This wasn't just a small spring or drainage system. As Ezekiel followed the water eastward, it grew dramatically. Verse 3 described the first measurement. "As the man went eastward with a measuring line in his hand, he measured off 1,000 cubits and then led me through water that was ankle deep. The water was already substantial enough to create a stream. Another 1,000 cubits further, the water had grown significantly." Verse 4 continued, "He measured off another 1,000 cubits and led me through water that was knee-deep. He measured off another 1,000 and led me through water that was up to the waist." The stream was becoming a river, fed by some supernatural source within the temple. The final measurement revealed something miraculous. Verse 5 described the climax. "He measured off another 1,000, but now it was a river that I could not cross, because the water had risen and was deep enough to swim in a river that no one could cross. In just 4,000 cubits, about 2 miles, ankle-deep water had become a major river. This river would bring life wherever it flowed." Verse 9 explained its power. "Swarms of living creatures will live wherever the river flows. There will be large numbers of fish, because this water flows there and makes the salt water fresh. So where the river flows, everything will live. Even the Dead Sea, which had been lifeless for millennia, would teem with fish when this river reached it. The vegetation along the riverbanks would be supernatural." Verse 12 described the miracle trees. "Fruit trees of all kinds will grow on both banks of the river. Their leaves will not wither, nor will their fruit fail. Every month they will bear fruit, because the water from the sanctuary flows to them. Their fruit will serve for food, and their leaves for healing." These trees would provide constant nourishment and medicine for God's people. This river flowing from the temple represented the life-giving power of God's presence among his people. Just as the temple would be the center of worship, it would also be the source of physical blessing that would transform the entire land into a paradise. With this supernatural irrigation system in place, the land could support a much larger population than ever before. The tribal allocations reflected this new abundance. In chapter 48, verse 1, the distribution began. These are the tribes listed by name. At the northern frontier, Dan will have one portion. Each tribe would receive territory, perfectly suited to their needs. The order of the tribes was significant. Instead of the traditional arrangement based on birth order or previous territorial claims, the tribes were arranged to ensure that the temple would be at the geographic center of the nation. Verse 8 identified the central portion, bordering. The territory of Judah from east to west will be the portion you are to present as a special gift. It will be 25,000 cubits wide, and its length from east to west will equal one of the tribal portions. The sanctuary will be in the center of it. This central area would be divided into 3 sections. The priests would receive the section containing the temple. The Levites would have the adjacent area for their cities, and the prince would have territory on both sides to provide for the civil government. Verse 15 described the city's portion. The remaining area, 5,000 cubits wide and 25,000 cubits long, will be for the common use of the city, for houses and for pasture land. The city will be in the center of it. The city itself would be perfectly planned and designed. Verse 16 specified its dimensions. These will be its measurements: the north side 4,500 cubits, the south side 4,500 cubits, the east side 4,500 cubits, and the west side 4,500 cubits. This square city would be surrounded by pasture land and supplied by workers from all the tribes. Each side of the city would have 3 gates named after the tribes, ensuring that every part of the nation had representation in the capital. Verses 31-34 listed all 12 gates. The gates of the city will be named after the tribes of Israel. The 3 gates on the north side will be the gate of Reuben, the gate of Judah, and the gate of Levi. On the east side, which is 4,500 cubits long, will be 3 gates: the gate of Joseph, the gate of Benjamin, and the gate of Dan. On the south side, which measures 4,500 cubits, will be 3 gates: the gate of Simeon, the gate of Issachar, and the gate of Zebulun. On the west side, which is 4,500 cubits long, will be 3 gates: the gate of Gad, the gate of Asher, and the gate of Naphtali. The new name of the city would reflect its greatest glory, the permanent presence of God among his people. Verse 35 concluded the entire book with this magnificent promise. The distance all around will be 18,000 cubits, and the name of the city from that time on will be, "The Lord is there." This wasn't just a geographical designation, it was a theological statement. The city would be known throughout the world, not for its wealth, its military power, its political influence, or its architectural beauty, but for the fact that the creator of the universe had chosen to dwell there permanently among his people. Equal distribution of land among the tribes would eliminate the economic inequalities that had contributed to social unrest in the past. No tribe would be disadvantaged by poor soil or limited water access, because the supernatural river would ensure that all areas were equally productive. The geometric precision of the boundaries would prevent the territorial disputes that had often led to conflict between tribes. There would be no ambiguity about who owned what, and no opportunity for stronger tribes to encroach on weaker ones. The central location of the temple and the city would ensure that worship remained the focus of national life. No tribe would be so far from the sanctuary that regular participation in festivals would be difficult, and the prince's territory surrounding the central area would guarantee that civil government would always be oriented towards supporting rather than competing with religious leadership. Most importantly, the entire arrangement would serve as a physical demonstration that God had kept his promises to restore his people to their land and renew his relationship with them. Every boundary marker, every city gate, every flowing stream would be evidence that the God who had seemed to abandon them during the dark days of exile had actually been planning their restoration all along. The vision ended where it had begun, 25 years earlier, with the overwhelming reality of God's presence among his people. But instead of the mobile throne chariot that had appeared by the Kibar River, or the departing glory that had left the old temple, this presence was stationary, permanent, and transformative. The name of the city, the Lord is there, captured the essence of everything Ezekiel had been called to prophesy. Judgment would give way to restoration. Exile would end in return, and the God who seemed distant would prove to be eternally near. If this journey through Ezekiel has opened your eyes to see God's power and faithfulness in a new way, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss another incredible biblical adventure. There are so many more amazing stories waiting to be discovered together. And here's the thing, someone in your life needs to hear this message of hope. Today, maybe they're going through their own valley of dry bones moment, feeling like their dreams are scattered and lifeless. Share this video with them. Let them see that the same God who promised to breathe life into Israel's hopeless situation is still breathing life into impossible circumstances today. Your like, your share, your comment, they all help spread these life-changing biblical truths to people who desperately need to hear them. Together, we can make sure everyone gets to experience the book of Ezekiel like they've never seen it before. So what are you waiting for? Subscribe, share, and let's continue exploring God's incredible word together.
There's some apparent historical inaccuracies with the date, and this might support this conclusion as well. You know, a little bit later date, maybe there's a little that's off as far as historical knowledge and so forth. So Tobit shows no knowledge of the Maccabean conflict, and so for this very reason, a number of scholars would say that, you know, this is a sign that it was written before the Maccabean conflict, very similar to Ben Sira or Sirach, which also doesn't really show any knowledge of this incredibly difficult conflict that took place. So you would expect there to be some insights into that conflict. Some scholars will say that maybe the emphasis on burying the dead is, you know, evidence that it was written around the Maccabean conflict, but that's really not, you know, completely convincing. You know, you would expect more than just that. So most scholars, as I said, they dated between 250 and 175 BC. There's some important Greek manuscripts. So if you look at some of the oldest books, codexes, and you look at the Vaticanus, the Alexandrinus, you'll see that most modern Bibles follow these ancient books. And it's really amazing because if this is like the beginning of really making books. And you've got Vaticanus and Alexandrinus, and these are, you know, almost complete versions of the Bible. And they've got deuterocanonical books in them like Sirach and Tobit. It shows how the church used these books, accepted these books as well. So that's where most of your modern Bibles are going to follow those editions. You have another edition from Sinaiticus, okay? And this manuscript, it varies with some slight details, okay? And as I mentioned before, you have some Aramaic and Hebrew fragments that have been found. So let's talk a little bit about the book of Tobit, okay? So Tobit, what's really interesting is, if you're familiar with the book of Job, you're going to see some similarities with Tobit and Job. This is really amazing. And you're also going to see how Tobit continually looks back into other stories in the Old Testament and draws similarities or comparisons. So let's just take Tobit and Job, for instance. So Tobit and Job were both righteous men. They suffered bodily afflictions. Both had to navigate through tensions in their marriage. Both got to the point where they thought they would be better off dead, that either prayed for death or longed for death. And each was vindicated after being tested. So there's stories of righteous men who were tested to the point of death, even longing for death, and then were vindicated. That's really amazing. So what about Tobit and the Hebrew Bible? Okay, so this is really amazing too. The book of Tobit draws from many of the motifs or stories or concepts which are found in the narrative of the Hebrew Bible. So Tobit, Tobias, Sarah constantly find, and this is the Sarah in the book of Tobit, by the way, constantly find common ground because the challenges that they face, they look back upon Israel's historical experience. And so when you're reading the book, you always want to ask yourself, is this looking back at something in the Hebrew Bible? And so as I go through these videos, my goal is to really show you a lot of these connections, to show you how a book written in the Second Temple period looks back into, the Hebrew Bible. And you'll see this in a lot of other books. Another book that does the same thing, when you get to First and Second Maccabees, you look at First and Second Maccabees, there's constant, looking back, or stories that are in many ways similar to stories that you find in earlier history in the Hebrew Bible. And so, there's something profound about that. It underlines that, in one sense, the challenges that we face today are similar. Our forefathers faced similar challenges. And then at another level, the same God who vindicated, guided, and blessed our forefathers will help us in the midst of our trials as well. So there's common experience, but especially a common experience because we are serving the one same God, okay? So there's something beautiful there and profoundly theological if you consider that. So by recalling Israel's history, the author underlines the providential manner in which the Lord continues to work in our lives, in the lives of Tobit, Sarah, and Tobias, and even in the most unfavorable circumstances, how the Lord works in our lives. This would have been very encouraging for Jews living under the rule of foreign empires during the Second Temple period. And what's also beautiful about some of the Second Temple literature, you really see an aspect of divine providence, okay? Where it doesn't always mention God doing something, but you see in some way a favorable circumstance working out for this righteous figure, okay? What's also interesting is there's a number of scholars who say that there's reference to an ancient story or legend that was very well known in the ancient world, the Ahikar story. It was extremely well known in the you could say in the Near East, okay, and especially during the Second Temple period. It recounts the story of a servant of a king who gave alms and adopted a son and treated this adopted son well and was even preparing him, to have a successful life. And unfortunately, his son actually betrayed him and he was falsely accused. But in the end of the story, he's vindicated. So this ancient story may go back as far as 400 BC. There's some variance in some of the ancient versions, so I'm just giving you the general details here. Okay, but Ahikar was eventually exonerated. And believe it or not, Tobit actually looks at this in chapter 14. When Tobit is talking to Tobias, he makes reference to this story and explains the importance of alms giving. In other words, living out a righteous life and really helping out the poor. Alms giving would be over and above your 10% tithe that you would give, where you're giving over and above, and especially their works of mercy towards the widow, the orphan, the foreigner, etc. So in addition, it's possible that Tobit's nephew, whose name is Achaicharos, was a royal servant in Nineveh and this may have been an intentional reference to the Ahikar story. Some scholars even argue that they're one and the same person. The conclusion is really never made in the book, but you get the idea. That this was a very well-known story. It's a secular story, but it's about it has a very good value that it transmits, and so you can see why Tobit chapter 14 might even make a reference to this story. Imagine Jews and even non-Jews reading this story and being inspired by it. So what about family struggles and family values? So the book of Tobit, it presents a variety of struggles that a family encounters while dwelling in the First Temple period, which is built by, First Temple was built by Solomon. So the context of the book, very interesting. It's all taking place in the First Temple period, the temple that was built by Solomon. This temple would eventually be destroyed in 587, 586 BC. And so it's all taking place in this period. The northern kingdom of Israel has been destroyed, and Tobit is such a righteous man that he will go on a pilgrimage all the way down to Jerusalem to pay his tithes, to worship on the feast days. And, no matter what the situation is, he wants to follow the law of God. And so he's not going to be deterred by the obstacles that he encounters, okay? And so along the way, there's a lot of family struggles. Tobit has a lot of struggles in his marriage and with his wife, with his child, and so forth. And so the book of Tobit, as we go through each chapter, we're going to really talk about the family values and the family struggles. And I think you're going to be really impressed by the way this book transmits family values. You're going to really see why this book was so popular in the ancient world. And that's something that you see, just based on all the manuscripts that are out there and, that contain Tobit. Okay. So what about devotion to the temple? That's another theme that you find. Tobit, as I mentioned, he lives in the northern kingdom. Okay. And then after it's conquered by the Assyrians, it's the former northern kingdom. So this is amazing to think that he would travel all the way to Jerusalem on required feast days, even after the Assyrians had conquered the northern kingdom. And what are those feast days where all men were required to go to Jerusalem? You might remember from New Testament studies that those feast days are Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. You find a good summary of that if you go to Deuteronomy chapter 16. So Tobit makes an extraordinary sacrifice to go to the temple and to worship on those feast days. Another theme is divine providence, the guidance by angels. So if you go to Exodus 23:20 to 22, the Lord promises to send his angel to go before the people of Israel and to guard them on the way. Okay, it's a very famous verse just before Israel enters into covenant with the Lord in Exodus 24. And so what's beautiful is building on that theme, you have this book where an angel is going to guide Tobit's son, Tobias, on the way of his journey. And it recalls other moments where we encounter angels in famous places in the Bible. You might go back and look at Genesis 19, the angels who protected Lot and his family. You could go to Joshua chapter 5, and even to the story of Samson. I think it's right around Judges chapter 12 or Judges chapter 13. So you have a number of other stories where angels protect people in the Old Testament, and then especially in the New Testament. If you go to Matthew's Gospel and you look at the dreams of Joseph and so forth, and how the Lord worked with his people and worked with Joseph and saved the Holy Family from certain trial. Okay, so the concept of divine providence, guidance by angels or protection from angels. The angel Raphael, the verb Rapha literally means, to heal. So Raphael, it means God's healing. Sometimes translated God's medicine, but it's probably better translated God's healing. It may look back to Exodus chapter 15, verse 26. Exodus 15, verse 26. And that's a famous verse where the Lord, after he brings his people out of Egypt, he really exhorts them to be obedient to him, and then declares, I, the Lord, am your healer, that he will protect them from all the plagues that came upon the Egyptians. I, the Lord, am your healer. Okay, so now we're going to go to chapter 1, and we're going to walk through the book of Tobit. So let's get started. Are you guys ready? That's a very short introduction. I think there's one other thing that I should just mention before this very quick introduction to the book of Tobit. And also, what's really interesting, if you look at some of the early councils in the early church, if you go to, for instance, the Council of Rome, you're going to see that the Council of Rome included what we call the 7 deuterocanonical books in its list of what the canon was: Wisdom, Sirach, otherwise known as Ben Sira or Ecclesiasticus, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Tobit, and Judith, okay? And then if you go to the Council of Hippo, once again, you see that Tobit, Judith, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Wisdom, they're all included in the canon. And then finally, the Council of Carthage, 397 BC. Okay, I'm sorry, this is all AD. You're also going to see that 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Tobit are also included in the canon. Baruch could have been included with Lamentations and Jeremiah. That's probably what happened there. Sometimes those 3 books were grouped together, where Jeremiah, Lamentations, and Baruch were all grouped together, okay? But the point that I want to make here is you see in the early church a little, consistency here, especially in the Western church, on the inclusion of Tobit in the canon of Scripture. As I mentioned before, when you look at some of the first codexes, books, you see Tobit is included as well, along with other deuterocanonical books. And it tells you something about the importance of reading these books, not just for private reading, but publicly reading them in the church, okay? So now we're going to go to chapter 1 of the book of Tobit, okay? And so let's start off and read the book of Tobit. So in these videos, I really want to just walk through each chapter. And the idea is to help people to understand the narrative in the book of Tobit, and especially to look at particular things in the narrative that are either theological or especially references to other books of the Bible. And I think it will really open up your eyes to how profound this book is. So we start off and it says, the book of the Acts of Tobit, the son of Tobiel, the son of Anaiel, the son of Aduel, the son of Gabael, of the descendants of Asiel, of the tribe of Naphtali. So Naphtali is a tribe which is all the way up near Galilee, okay? It's up near the Sea of Galilee. And there's arguments over, exactly what area it encompassed. Sometimes you'll see that the area of the tribes varied a little bit depending on the time period, but it's up in the north. It's near the Sea of Galilee. And what's really cool about the book of Tobit is it gives this pretty long genealogy, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 generations at least. And then it goes on and says, who in the days of Shalmaneser, the king of the Assyrians, was taken into captivity from Thisbe, which is to the south of Kadesh Naphtali, in Galilee above Asher. So that's a pretty good way of locating exactly where he lived. And what's interesting is most scholars will say that the book of Tobit, the book of Judith, the book of Ruth are presenting these stories to us which are not necessarily based on history, but they are written to encourage Jews during a time of trial. So most scholars would say that about the book of Tobit, although when you really read it, you'll see that some of the details might not be 100% correct. They might be a little bit off. But then there's also great detail here, which is really interesting, okay? So it starts in the north, and this is important because the northern kingdom will be destroyed by the Assyrians. And it says, I, Tobit, walked in the ways of truth and righteousness. So it begins by talking about how righteous this man was, very similar to the book of Job, if you read the book of Job. So I walked in the ways of truth and righteousness all the days of my life, and I performed many acts of charity. So one thing to really consider is almsgiving is tied to charitable works, okay? So don't separate those two, but see how those two are interrelated, okay? And especially almsgiving would be acts of charity, especially to the poor, and unfortunate. So I performed many acts of charity to my brethren and countrymen who went with me into the land of the Assyrians. So many of them were taken into exile, okay? And this is really interesting because Tobit is explaining that he's being taken into exile to Nineveh. Nineveh is the great capital of the Assyrian Empire. If you remember the book of Jonah, if you read the book of Jonah, Jonah has to go preach repentance to the people of Nineveh, and he doesn't want to preach to his enemies. He doesn't want to preach to these people who are going to destroy the northern kingdom. So there's a lot of irony in the book of Jonah. I have a playlist on the book of Jonah. If you go to the playlist in this channel, you can find Jonah and listen to those videos. So he goes on and he says, now when I was in my own country in the land of Israel, while I was still a young man, the whole tribe of Naphtali, okay, and my forefather, okay, deserted the house of Jerusalem. So what he's referring to here, especially, you can find this if you go to the book of 1 Kings and you read from basically chapter 12 all the way to chapter 16. It talks about how the northern kingdom fell into apostasy. 1 Kings chapters 12 to 16. And apostasy is essentially a complete falling away of the faith. So what do? They began to worship false gods. And the worship of false gods was institutionalized in the northern kingdom. So Tobit explains this. And the second thing that they did is the reason why this apostasy took place was that the new king of the northern kingdom, whose name was Jeroboam, he did not want the people to go to Jerusalem because they would be paying their tithes and giving their money to the temple in Jerusalem. And so therefore, he created his own religious system, all about money. What a surprise. And so he put up an altar in the north in Dan, another altar in the south, and he put a golden calf on each of those altars. They worship the golden calf. Can you imagine this? And so by doing that, he kept the people from going out of the kingdom to the north or going down to Jerusalem in the south. And so essentially it was for economic reasons, and also there were some political reasons involved as well. So he goes on and he says this was the place which had been chosen, that's Jerusalem. And you see that especially emphasized in the book of Deuteronomy, where it talks about the place that God will choose. And then when you go to 2 Samuel chapter 5, that's when David goes and he conquers Zion. And then in 2 Samuel 5 and 6, he brings the Ark of the Covenant to Zion. And eventually in chapter 7, the Lord speaks to him through the prophet Nathan. And he tells David he will always have a king upon his throne, but he won't build the temple. His son will build the temple. And that son would be Solomon, who would build the temple. And so in all these acts, the conquering of Jerusalem in 2 Samuel chapter 5, the bringing of the ark to Jerusalem, 2 Samuel 6, the dynastic promise, which is in 2 Samuel 7. The Lord is choosing Jerusalem as the place of worship, okay? And Tobit is simply explaining that. This was the place which had been chosen, okay? Jerusalem had been chosen by the Lord as a place of worship. When you get into the New Testament, the conversation with the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4, it's over this very question, okay? And so in Jerusalem, the place which had been chosen from among all the tribes of Israel, where all the tribes should sacrifice, and where the temple, the dwelling of the Most High, was consecrated and established for all generations. And so there's something beautiful here. So it's the place of sacrifice, and it's the place where the temple is, which is the place where God dwells, the dwelling of the Most High. And when you get to John chapter 4, Jesus explains that the place where people worship will neither be Mount Gerizim nor Jerusalem, but true worshipers will worship the Lord in spirit and in truth. Okay, and so the temple was the place where God dwelt. It was the place where his throne was, the King of Kings, the King of Israel, the place where Israel sacrificed. But when the Christ came into the world, he laid down his life, and he talked about destroying this temple and raising it up in 3 days. And now the new temple is not a building, but it's now in Christ. It's a spiritual temple. Okay, so when you read the New Testament, go to Ephesians chapter 2, go to Hebrews chapter 12. The new temple is a spiritual temple. Christ himself is the cornerstone of this new temple. Each of us is a living stone in this new temple. But you get some insights here into Tobit's understanding of the temple during the Second Temple period, okay? So he says that all the tribes that joined in apostasy used to sacrifice to the calf Baal. So they're sacrificing to a false god. And so did the house of Naphtali, my forefather. And so he's essentially explaining how his tribe fell into apostasy with all the tribes in the north. And he goes on, he says, but I alone went to Jerusalem for the feast. So he's essentially saying that even though they all were worshiping false gods, that I went to Jerusalem to worship the Lord. So Tobit presents himself as a man who will not compromise with the evil that is happening all around him. He's still going to go to Jerusalem, even though all of his forefathers, all the tribes in the north, are sacrificing to these false gods. Okay, and so this is before the destruction of the northern kingdom in 722. And as it is ordained for all Israel by an everlasting decree, taking the first fruits and the tithes of my produce and the first shearings, I would give these to the priests, the sons of Aaron, at the altar. Okay, and so I'm just going to look at what would be said, and we're going to switch screens here. And if you go to Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 26, okay, it talks about what the ancient Israelites would say as they brought the first fruits to present them to the Lord. They would say this little prayer, okay? It says, and you shall make response before the Lord your God. Here's the prayer they would say. A wandering Aramean was my father, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there, few in number. And there he became a great nation. He became a nation great, mighty, and populous. And the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us and laid upon us hard bondage. Then we cried to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. And the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with great terror with signs and wonders, and he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And behold, now I bring the first of the fruit of the ground which thou, O Lord, hast given me. And you shall set it down before the Lord your God and worship before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice in all the good which the Lord your God has given to you and to your house, you and the Levite and the sojourner who is among you. And so it goes on, and it's talking about this little prayer. It's almost like an ancient creed, okay, that was said in Deuteronomy chapter 26. And so Tobit is essentially referring to this, that he would literally go to the temple, okay, and he would offer his first fruits to the Lord. He would give him the first of the produce of the land. He would take that journey to Jerusalem. And he goes on and he says this, and he says, I would give these to the priests, the sons of Aaron, at the altar. All of my produce I would give, a tenth to the sons of Levi. So he's paying what's called his tithe. His tithe, a tenth of all his produce, who ministered at Jerusalem. But now he goes on and he says, a second tenth I would sell, and I would go and spend the proceeds each year at Jerusalem. Okay, and why is he doing this? He wants to help the local economy in Jerusalem. Isn't that beautiful if you think about it? Now, why would he do that? Well, if you remember, the northern kingdom, it broke away from the southern kingdom partially over money, finance. We want to keep people from going to Jerusalem and paying their tithes in Jerusalem. And so here is Tobit, a righteous Jew or a righteous Israelite, and he refuses to compromise with that. As a matter of fact, I'm going to help the economy out in Jerusalem. Okay, so you can understand why he's doing this with the proceeds. And then it says, the third tenth I would give to those to whom it was my duty, as Deborah, my father's mother, had commanded me, for I was left an orphan by my father. So this is really amazing. He was left an orphan by his father, and his father's mother, Deborah, sounds like it wasn't his biological mother, she raised him up. She took care of him. She adopted this orphan. And so what does she do? She commands him to go and to really take care of the poor and the vulnerable. So a third, as was his duty, as Deborah, this righteous woman, commanded him, he would give, and he would give it away to those who were in need. So there's something beautiful here of, if you look at the story, a woman who adopted this son who wasn't her own as her own, and then commands him, now you go out and help others out. You can really see the values that are in the book of Tobit. And many times it's the concept of don't just do what you need to do, but go over and above of what you need to do. And this concept runs throughout the book. So we're going to talk about this. And what I like about it is in the context of the family, okay? So here, Tobit he's left an orphan by his father. So it says, when I became a man, I married Anna, a member of our family, and by her I became the father of Tobiah. So he's just given us the story of his family right here. And it goes on and it says, now when I was carried away captive to Nineveh. So it changes now to, this is 722 BC. The northern kingdom is destroyed by the Assyrians, and now he's being taken away, and he's being taken out of Israel proper. He's being taken all the way to the Assyrian capital, Nineveh, okay? And it says, all my brethren and my relatives ate the food of the Gentiles, but I kept myself from eating it. Now, this reminds you a little bit of the book of Daniel. If you read the book of Daniel, you'll see how Daniel went out of his way to not eat the food of the Gentiles, okay, even though he lived among Gentiles. And so there's other books that might come to mind if you read the book of Ezekiel as well, the prophecy of Ezekiel, that the prophecy, much of it is taking place and written among Ezekiel, the prophet, who is taken into exile, and he lives something like 100 miles south of the city of Babylon. Okay. So here he is, he's among the Gentiles, he's in a Gentile city, he's in the capital, but he's not going to defile himself with their food, which may have been offered to false gods. So I kept myself from eating it because I remembered God with all my heart. And this could be a reference to the famous Shema in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 through 7. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. Okay. Along with many other mentions or exhortations in the book of Deuteronomy to love God with all your heart. And he goes on and he says, then the Most High gave me favor and good appearance in the sight of Shalmaneser, and I was his buyer of provisions. So I used to go to Media, and at once at Ragus in Media, I left 10 talents of silver in trust with Gabael, the brother of Gabrias. Now, this whole story of going to Media and leaving 10 talents of silver, this is setting up for the plot in the book of Tobit. Okay, so eventually what's going to happen is Tobit is going to send his son Tobias to go back and get those 10 talents of silver. Now, a talent is an incredible amount of money. The amount of a talent could have varied over time, but it would have been thousands of pieces of silver or hundreds of pieces of silver. We're going to look at this when we go into my notes in just a bit. And so traditionally it was the amount, the weight that a person could carry. Many scholars would say between 80 and 120 pounds, but there's quite a variance when you get into what a talent is, okay? And so we'll talk about this when we get into the notes, but it's a large quantity nonetheless. And he goes on and he says, but when Shalmaneser died, Sennacherib, his son, reigned in his place, and under him the highways were unsafe, so I could no longer go into Media. And in the days of Shalmaneser, I performed many acts of charity to my brethren. And I would give my bread to the hungry and my clothing to the naked. Now you find this image of giving your bread to the hungry and clothing the naked. You're probably thinking of Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 to 46, and you're right. But you actually also find this same image in Isaiah chapter 58. And so what's beautiful is how the book of Tobit shows us a living faith. Let's just take a quick look at Isaiah 58, just to kind of get the background here. So we're going to go to Isaiah 58. I think I've got you on the correct screen right here. Yes, we do. Okay. And so we're going to just look at this famous passage. It's actually proclaimed during Lent. Okay. Starts off saying, cry out loud, spare not, lift up your voice like a trumpet, declare to my people their transgressions, to the house of Jacob their sins. And it goes on here, and it talks about drawing near to the Lord, okay? They ask of me righteous judgments. They delight to draw near to God. Why have we fasted, and thou seest it not? Why have we humbled ourselves, and thou takest no knowledge of it? Behold, in the days of your fast you seek your own pleasure, and oppress all your workers. Behold, you fast only to quarrel and to fight, and to hit with wicked fist. Fasting like yours this day will not make your voice to be heard on high. Hey, we proclaim this verse often during Lent. I think it might even be on Ash Wednesday, or the first week of Lent. Maybe it's the first Friday of Lent, but you'll hear it right at the beginning of Lent. And so it goes on and it says, is such the fast that I choose, a day for a man to humble himself? Is it to bow down his head like a rush and to spread sackcloth and ashes under him? Will you call this a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? Is this not the fast that I choose? Look at what he says, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the thongs of the yoke. In other words, oppression. to let the oppressed go free, to break every yoke, every form of unjust oppression? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, to bring the homeless poor into your house, when you see the naked to cover him? And it goes on from there. So you see, Tobit, essentially, he's doing exactly what Isaiah 58 says. I gave my bread to the hungry, my clothing to the naked. And so Jesus, our Lord, he picks up on this in the Gospels. Okay, so when you read, especially Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 to 46, those famous words where our Lord says, whatsoever you did to the least of my brethren, you have done to me. Okay, he uses similar examples. And so Tobit goes on and he says, and if I saw any one of my people dead and thrown out behind the wall of Nineveh, I would bury him. So he gives his people an honorable burial. He won't just let their bodies sit out there and be, eaten away by birds. But this is a main theme in the book of Tobit, that he gives his people an honorable burial, the ones who have been slain. So there's really an image of great oppression here in the book, okay? And it goes on, it says, if Sennacherib the king put to death anyone who came fleeing from Judea, I buried them secretly, okay? So he's really risking his life to do this. For in his anger, he put many to death. And when the bodies were sought by the king, they were not found. Then one of the men in Nineveh went and informed the king about me, that I was burying them. So I hid myself. So he's doing this righteous deed to bury the dead, to give them an honorable burial. And now he's hiding himself. You might remember, a few different stories where biblical figures had to hide themselves. So for instance, Moses was hidden by his mother because the Pharaoh was trying to kill the young children. And you might remember that David, during various periods of his life, he had to hide from Saul, and he also had to hide from his son Absalom. Okay, and so here's Tobit. He's hiding simply because he's doing a righteous deed. And when I learned that I was being searched for to be put to death, I left home in fear. Then all my property was confiscated and nothing was left to me except my wife Anna and my son Tobias. So literally he lost everything. He's doing a righteous deed and he loses everything because he's a righteous man. So this story here, all the events here are helping Jews in the Second Temple period. They're living under empires that are over them. And when they read the book of Tobit, they see an example of don't give up. Even if you have difficult circumstances around you, continue to live the faith in righteousness, okay? And so Tobit can leave with nothing more than his family. He's fleeing for his life. He takes his wife Anna, he takes his son Tobias. And he goes on, he says, but not 50 days passed before two of Sennacherib's sons killed him, and they fled to the mountains of Ararat. And then Esarhaddon, his son, reigned in his place, and he appointed Ahikar, the son of my brother Aniel, over all the accounts of his kingdom and over the entire administration. Ahikar interceded for me, and I returned to Nineveh. Now, Ahikar was cupbearer, keeper of the signet, in charge of the administration of the accounts, for Esarhaddon had appointed him second to himself, and he was my nephew. So it's very interesting because there's a lot of references to the story of Joseph, and in this case, this person, Ahikar, who's the nephew of Tobit, he's just like Joseph. He's second in the kingdom. And as I mentioned, that there was a popular story about a righteous official in the ancient world as well. And so, it's interesting to see this. And so many scholars will say that, in some way, Tobit is making a reference to this well-known story, or, it just happens to be coincidence, but they have the same name, okay? And so that's pretty amazing. And so what's going to happen? Okay, his nephew interceded for him, and he says, I return to Nineveh. Okay, and so on behalf of his nephew who interceded for him, he returned to Nineveh. So let's go through our notes here. Okay, so just a couple notes on the book of Tobit. Scholars contend that the book of Tobit does not intend to present literal history. There are some who do argue for literal history, so I don't want to say that this is a slam dunk by any means, but most scholars understand it as not a linear history, okay, but it's more concerned with a historical situation to convey a message of faith, okay? And so that's how most scholars would see this. They would group it with the book of Judith and the book of Esther in a similar, some of them would call this novelas, but I think novela is not a good name because it's a secular thing. It's better to classify it as a story of faith, or a story meant to inspire faith. So hence the book opens recounting that Shalmaneser deported the captives from Naphtali. And in fact, it appears that this deportation was carried out by his predecessor, Tiglath-Pileser. And you see that in 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 29. So Tobit 1:15, it recounts that Sennacherib was the son of Shalmaneser, when in fact Sargon was his son. Tobit chapter 14 contends that it was Nebuchadnezzar who destroyed the city of Nineveh, when in fact it was his father Nabopolassar who destroyed Nineveh in 612 BC, while a generation later Nebuchadnezzar II would destroy the city of Jerusalem and exile the captives of Judah somewhere between 597 to 586 BC. So Tobit, similar to Job, he's described as a man who lived a righteous life. As I explained, he suffers unexplained hardships because of his righteous life. And it's very similar to the story of Job, is because Job is righteous, he suffers these hardships. Chapter 1 tells us that Tobit walked in the ways of truth and righteousness. And the description of a righteous character in any biblical book is always important. So you want to see, how does the book describe that character, whether it's Abraham, Noah, Job, or Tobit. Look at that description, because it's going to tell you something about that person's character. And there's often an example that's meant to be emulated, followed. He walked in the ways of truth and righteousness all the days of his life. He did many acts of charity or almsgiving, okay, to his brethren, and also to Gentiles. Thus, he did not play favorites, but he showed such charity to both sons of Israel and to Gentiles. So Tobit, the suffering that Tobit endured would have encouraged or been encouraging to those who lived during the exile or the Second Temple period. So, or the Second Temple period. All right. And so Tobit chapter 1 verse 4, Tobit speaks about when his forefathers deserted the house in Jerusalem. Now the house is often a term used for the temple, the Lord's house or the house. You'll see this in scripture, okay? So when you're reading, the Psalms, when you're reading some of the historical books and you see references to the house of the Lord or the house in Jerusalem, know that that's not any house, that's the temple itself. And it goes all the way back to 2 Samuel chapter 7, when the Lord talks about two houses. He talks about building a house for David, and that house is the Davidic dynasty, and Solomon building a house for the Lord, which would be the temple, okay? And so that's why you see this particular terminology, the house. So a reference to the temple as the house it's often referred to as the Lord's house. Thus, he refers to when the northern kingdom initially under Jeroboam I formed a new kingdom, which would be called the kingdom of Israel. That would be Jeroboam I. And he initially started with 10 tribes, or you could say 9.5 tribes, because he had half of the tribe of Levi in the north and half of the tribe of Levi in the south. So Often when you're reading books, it'll either say 10 tribes or 9.5 tribes that broke away with Jeroboam. So Jeroboam also established shrines with golden calves in the north of the northern kingdom at a city called Dan, and then in the south at a city called Bethel, okay? And if you want more on this, I also have a playlist on First Kings, and I go into great detail. Just go to the playlist on this channel, look for First and Second Kings, and I walk through all of this history. And it's very important to know to understand the background to many biblical books. So Tobit travels to Jerusalem, okay? He's going for 3 feast days. All males who were at military age, basically 20 years old, were required to go to Jerusalem. Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles. You find it. Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 16 is one of the places you find it, where they are required to go to Jerusalem to appear before the Lord. Okay, and so Tobit is doing this even in the worst of times. He's bringing tithes, and as I mentioned, the tithes are divided into 3 portions, okay? One for the Levitical priests, for the temple, one where he spends it so that the city itself will flourish, okay? And then finally, a 3rd portion, which is given to those who are suffering. And this is following the instruction of Deborah, who was his father's mother, which, because he was an orphan. And it's so amazing, like she commands him, here she is taking care of this orphan child, and she's saying, now you go out and take care of orphans. So there's, if you look closely at the story, there's beautiful family values here, where a family, Deborah, she's showing this great love for Tobit, and now she's commanding him to go out and show the same love. And so he rather than just giving 10% tithe, he's out spending 30% of all that he has on tithes. That's pretty beautiful, if you ask me. And so when you look deeply into the story, you see the family value there. As I have done for you, now you go out over and above and share the same love with others. So Tobit is depicted as a man who not only tithes, but also exercises great concern for others. He honors the request of his adopted grandmother. And so the book of Tobit shows how good family values overflow and they bless others. There's something beautiful here implied. When we honor our parents, when we honor those who have gone out of their way to love us in the family, then that's going to overflow. We're going to go outside of our family and help people out. Okay, so in the Second Temple period, this would have been extremely important, because you could see how many people could have been potentially separated from their families, and to encounter people with such love that would reaffirm their faith and bring stability to their lives. And the church is a family. So in a similar way, as we have received so much from our Lord Jesus, let us go out and let us share all those blessings with others. So going on a little bit here, Tobit married Anna, okay, and he begot Tobias. Tobias was his son. And when they were taken to Nineveh, they would not eat the bread of the Gentiles, okay? In this case, the bread of the Gentiles could refer in a general manner to the food of the Gentiles. So it's very similar to Daniel chapters 1 through 3, okay? Especially Daniel and his friends who will not defile themselves with Gentile food. So we see that Tobit and his family are committed to maintaining their purity, okay, even while they're in the land of Gentiles. And so Tobit explains that he prospered because the Lord gave him grace and outward appearance. Wow, in the presence of the king. So he was given grace and outward appearance in the presence of the king. It does in some way remind you of the book of Esther. If you go and read the book of Esther, and you see similarities also in the book in the story of Joseph, which is in the book of Genesis, and also the story of Daniel. So in many ways, Tobit's situation in exile, it recalls the situation of Joseph in Egypt, and as I mentioned, Esther and also Daniel, okay? And so what happens? Joseph was falsely accused, okay? And Tobit is going to be accused, well, for doing something that's essentially a good work, a work of mercy, and he's going to have to run for his life. So we hear about the 10 talents of silver. Tobit recounts that he left 10 talents of silver at Rages in Media during the reign of Shalmaneser. And a talent of silver was a great amount of money. So some would estimate it to be between 3,000 and 3,600 shekels of silver. You can just imagine the amount. Typically it was the amount that somebody could carry, that a soldier could carry. So 80 pounds of silver maybe, or 100 pounds of silver. Just imagine that. It's a lot of silver. So after his death, the death of this leader, Shalmaneser, the highways became unsafe to travel under his son, okay? And so thus the 10 talents of silver, they just remained there. Tobit couldn't go get them. So this is all setting us up for the story. So Tobit bought goods for the king. He was able to help his fellow Israelites who were also exiled in Media. Tobit followed the instructions of Isaiah, sharing his bread with the hungry and also clothing the naked and giving alms to the poor and proper burial to the dead. And it's the proper burial to the dead that's going to get him in a lot of trouble. So he tells us that Sennacherib killed many of his fellow Israelites, but that he would make haste to bury their bodies. And his respect for his brother Israelites quickly places him at odds with the king, who eventually will seek to put him to death. So in this scene, we recall that the Pharaoh sought to put Moses to death, and Moses fled, although Moses was a guilty man. And in this case, Tobit is an innocent man. So Moses and Tobit both shared great care for their own countrymen. You might remember the situation where Moses saw the Egyptian striking the Israelite, and he struck the Egyptian and killed the Egyptian and buried the Egyptian, and then he fled when he found out that everybody knew what happened. In this case, Tobit is burying his own fellow countrymen. He's innocent, and now he has to flee for his life. So there's many similarities, but also some differences. And point that I want to make is, look at how this story in the Second Temple period, it's constantly looking back to all these other stories in Scripture that we're familiar with, and it's showing us that the struggles that our forefathers faced are similar to the struggles that we have today. But the same God is going to guide us, protect us, and bless us, okay? And that's very important. So here we go. So Tobit left everything behind. He lost all his possessions except his wife and his son. And however, before 50 days had transpired, the king that desired to kill Tobit was killed by his own sons. And the new king appointed Ahikar, Tobit's nephew, as the administrator of the kingdom. And Ahikar interceded for Tobit, and he was able to return to Nineveh. And the appointment of a close relative as the administrator of the king may recall the position that Mordecai held in the book of Esther. Well, my brothers and sisters, on those notes, I finished with chapter 1. You can see how complex the book is, and I'm going to try to walk through each chapter in the book. There's a lot in every single chapter in the book of Tobit. So we'll try to take it one chapter at a time. And as we walk through this book, and as we reflect on the struggles of Tobit, let us turn to the Lord in every difficulty we have and trust that he will also guide us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Have a blessed day, and may the Lord continue to fill his entire church with many blessings